He marries his enemy's daughter for revenge, but the scars on her body render him speechless. Alessandro De Luca returns to Chicago after 8 years in exile with a single goal: to destroy the Moretti family from within. Marriage is the weapon. The girl is the pawn. But the first night he sees her back, covered in burns, whip marks, and misaligned fractures, he realizes he's aimed at the wrong person, and his real enemy is still sleeping soundly in his mansion. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't miss a second. The rain came in sideways off Lake Michigan, turning the October streets into black mirrors that reflected nothing useful. Alessandro De Luca stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse suite he'd rented under a false name, watching Chicago bleed neon into the wet pavement 40 stories below, and he felt nothing he hadn't felt in 8 years. That was the point. He'd spent the better part of a decade burning every feeling down to the root until what remained was something cleaner and far more dangerous than rage. Rage made mistakes. Rage telegraphed itself. What Alessandro carried now had no name that fit neatly in English or Italian. It was more like architecture, something built in the dark load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall until the structure could hold the weight of what was coming. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and checked the time. 11:47. His flight from Zurich had landed at O'Hare 6 hours ago, and he'd taken a car service, paid cash, told the driver he was visiting family. The driver had looked at him in the rearview mirror once and then decided, correctly, not to look again. Marco Rinaldi was waiting for him in the suite's dining area with 2 cups of espresso cooling on the marble table and a manila folder thick enough to be mistaken for a small novel. Marco was 51, built like a former heavyweight who'd spent the last 20 years behind a desk instead of a corner, and he'd been Alessandro's father's consigliere before the world ended. That made him the only man alive Alessandro trusted past the length of his own arm. "You look like shit," Marco said by way of greeting. "I look exactly how I'm supposed to look." Alessandro sat down and pulled the folder toward him without touching the espresso. "Tell me it's clean." Every thread tied back 6 months minimum. Cook County Clerk's office, the appellate judge, the property records, all of it moved through 3 separate shell companies, 2 of which don't technically exist anymore. Marco wrapped both hands around his own cup. "You've been back in this city 6 hours, and you're already the 3rd largest commercial property owner in the loop. Vittorio hasn't connected it yet." "He will." "Yes, but not until after." Alessandro opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, surveillance, distance lens, slightly grainy in the way that suggested it was taken without the subject's awareness. A woman walking down a tree-lined street in Lincoln Park. Dark coat, dark hair pulled back. She moved with her shoulders drawn inward, like someone who'd learned at some point that taking up space was an invitation for consequences. Isabella Moretti. 28 years old, Vittorio Moretti's youngest daughter, the only one the public had barely seen in 4 years. Alessandro studied the photograph the way a contractor studies a blueprint, looking for load-bearing elements, structural weaknesses, entry points. "She lives in the family house?" he asked. "East wing, separate entrance, but she doesn't use it much. Goes out maybe twice a week, grocery store, sometimes a walk. Always one of Vittorio's men within 30 feet. Marco paused. "She doesn't appear to have friends." "Deliberately isolated?" "That's how it reads." Alessandro set the photograph down and looked at the next page. Financial records. Isabella had no accounts in her own name, no credit cards, a clothing budget administered through Vittorio's personal assistant, phone bills paid by the estate. She was a grown woman living inside an infrastructure of control, so total it barely left a seam to find. He'd seen this before. Not often, but enough to recognize the shape of it. "Set up the meeting with Conti," Alessandro said. "The judge?" "He owes us for the Naperville situation. I want a marriage license processed in Lake County. Quiet. Inside a week." Marco was quiet for a moment. "You're actually going through with it. That was always the plan." "Alessandro." Marco set down his cup. His voice carried the specific weight of a man who knew better than to argue but was going to anyway. "The girl has nothing to do with what her father did. She has his name. That's not the same thing. Alessandro looked up from the folder. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the low light of the suite, and whatever lived behind them had stopped being comfortable to look at directly sometime around his 23rd year. You think I'm going to hurt her? I think your plan requires using her, which is not the same as hurting her, but it's not far from the door either. She'll be safer with me than she is in that house. He said it flatly, like a statement of logistics, and turned back to the folder. Marco picked up his espresso and said nothing else on the subject, which was the most honest response he could give. Outside, the rain picked up. Somewhere below, a car alarm started and stopped. Chicago hummed its indifferent frequency into the night. 80 million years of commerce and blood and reinvention packed into a grid of streets that had burned once and rebuilt itself and never quite learned the lesson. Alessandro read until 2 in the morning and then slept for 4 hours, dreamless and still, like a man with a clear conscience or a man who no longer had one. The Moretti estate sat on a private road off Sheridan Avenue in Evanston, separated from the neighbors by 6 feet of limestone wall, and a reputation that made the neighbors glad for the separation. It was a Tudor revival built in the 1920s, the kind of house that had hosted 3 generations of power lunches and quiet funerals, and conversations that never made it into any record. Vittorio Moretti had inherited it from his father, and had spent 40 years making sure it would never leave the family's hands. Alessandro drove past it twice on a Tuesday afternoon in a rental car with Illinois plates. He didn't slow down. He simply looked and cataloged and drove away. He'd done his homework on Vittorio Moretti long before he'd returned to Chicago. Some of it he'd carried for 8 years like a stone in his chest. The rest he'd assembled methodically in Zurich, and then in Milan, and then in the months before his return, piece by piece, the way you assemble something you intend to eventually dismantle. Vittorio was 71 now, prostate cancer, stage 2, diagnosed 14 months ago, and apparently responding to treatment well enough that he continued operating with his full faculties intact. He still chaired the weekly meetings of what remained of the North Shore Syndicate's legitimate face, a holding company called Meridian Consolidated that technically dealt in commercial real estate and port management. He still had dinner every Thursday with the 3rd District Alderman. He still had 16 men on the street and a federal handler he'd been feeding information to for the better part of 2 decades, which was how Alessandro's father had ended up bleeding out in the back seat of a black Escalade on a Tuesday night in October, 8 years ago, almost to the day. The federal immunity deal had been Vittorio's masterstroke. He'd handed the DeLucas to the Justice Department in exchange for clean hands and expanded territory, an act of betrayal so thorough and so precisely timed that Alessandro had spent years simply trying to understand the architecture of it before he could begin building anything against it. Understanding it fully had taken until his 30th year. What he'd understood, finally, was that Vittorio Moretti's only consistent vulnerability was legacy, not money. Vittorio could rebuild money, not territory. Territory was negotiable. Legacy was different. Legacy was the reason the man had kept the Tudor house and the Meridian Consolidated name and the Moretti brand intact through every pressure the decade had brought. Legacy was what you left behind when everything else was taken. Alessandro intended to be inside the legacy before Vittorio understood what was happening. Marrying Isabella would accomplish 3 things simultaneously. It would give Alessandro legal standing to access certain Moretti financial instruments that Isabella technically held partial interest in through her mother's estate. It would publicly bind the DeLuca name to Moretti blood, which was a symbolic humiliation Vittorio would feel in his chest every morning he woke up. And most importantly, it would install Alessandro inside the one structure Vittorio had spent 40 years protecting. Vittorio wouldn't refuse. Alessandro had taken considerable care to ensure that refusing would cost more than accepting. 3 of Vittorio's subsidiary operations had already been quietly strangled. Not enough to panic the old man, enough to make him feel the walls moving inward. The marriage proposal, delivered through intermediaries as a business arrangement, would arrive as a lifeline dressed up as an insult. Vittorio would accept because Vittorio always chose survival over pride when survival was still an option. He accepted on a Wednesday. The message came through 2 layers of cutouts, formal and cold, and written in the language of men who'd been doing business with enemies for so long that the transaction had its own grammar. Alessandro read the message in the penthouse suite, with Marco sitting across from him, and felt the thing in his chest that wasn't quite satisfaction. Satisfaction implied completion. This was only the first door. "He wants a meeting," Marco said. "He'll get one. At the signing." Alessandro folded the message and set it down. "He doesn't get to look me in the eye before that. He doesn't get to take my measure before I'm already inside the house." "And the girl? Does she know?" Alessandro was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the lake was steel gray and flat under a November sky that couldn't commit to any weather. "She'll be told what she needs to be told." Isabella Moretti found out about the marriage the way she found out about most things that affected her life, through her father's assistant, delivered as a fait accompli rather than a conversation, with a timeline so compressed it barely allowed for the processing of breath. Lucia, who had been her father's personal assistant for 11 years and who had the emotional temperature of a well-maintained filing cabinet, told her on a Monday morning in the sitting room off the East Wing, "Your father has arranged a marriage. The ceremony will take place in 3 weeks. Here are the relevant papers for you to review." Isabella looked at the papers Lucia set on the side table. Then she looked at Lucia. "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" "A marriage has been arranged. Alessandro De Luca. Your father will brief you further this evening if you have questions." Lucia left. Isabella sat in the sitting room for a long time after that. The room was decorated in shades of cream and pale gold that her mother had chosen 30 years ago and that no one had ever changed. And the morning light came through the east-facing windows in a way that had been familiar to Isabella since childhood, and that felt, in that moment, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Alessandro De Luca. She knew the name. In this world, everyone knew the name. What it had been, what had happened to it, what the rumors said it was becoming again. She'd heard her father speak it over the years in the particular tone he reserved for things he was actively managing, which meant things he was actively afraid of. She did not know what it meant that Alessandro De Luca wanted to marry her. She knew enough about how the world she'd grown up in worked to understand that nobody in it married for reasons that had anything to do with the people getting married. She'd understood this abstractly for years. She simply hadn't understood it would arrive like this, on a Monday morning through an intermediary, 3 weeks' notice, no question in the delivery. That evening, her father summoned her to his study. Vittorio Moretti, at 71, was still a large man. Broad through the shoulders, white-haired now, carrying the illness in a slight economy of movement that was the only visible concession he'd made to it. His study smelled of tobacco and old paper, and something underneath that Isabella had never been able to name exactly, but that had been the smell of fear to her since she was 9 years old. "Sit down," he said without looking up from his desk. She sat. "You've been told about the arrangement." "Lucia told me this morning." "Good." He turned a page on his desk. "The ceremony is in 3 weeks. You'll conduct yourself appropriately. You'll sign what's put in front of you. You will not discuss our family's affairs with De Luca under any circumstances." Isabella's hands were in her lap. She kept them still. "What does he want?" Her father looked up then. His eyes were pale blue, and they'd been doing a particular thing to her since childhood. A flat, assessing look that was almost clinical, like he was determining structural load. "That's not your concern. He wants something. People like him don't." "Isabella." The word was a door closing. "You will do what you're told. That's the entirety of your role in this." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down. "Yes," she said. "I understand." She left the study and walked back to the East Wing through corridors she knew by heart and closed the door of her room behind her and stood with her back against it in the dark. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the door behind her until the shaking slowed. She thought, at least it would be a different house. The thought frightened her a little, how clearly it came, how uncomplicated it felt. She'd been inside this house for 4 years as something that was technically not a prisoner and that was functionally nothing else, and the prospect of being handed to a man who almost certainly intended to use her as leverage in a war she didn't fully understand was sitting inside her chest with an almost peaceful quality, which told her something about the last 4 years that she preferred not to look at directly. The wedding was held on a Friday evening in late November. The venue was a private event space in the West Loop that Alessandro had rented for the occasion, deliberately not a hotel, not a restaurant, not any place with staff who would remember it warmly. The room held 40 people, 15 of Alessandro's inner circle, 12 of Vittorio's, a handful of required legal witnesses, and a justice of the peace who had been paid enough to process the ceremony quickly and remember it vaguely. Isabella wore a dress that Lucia had selected, ivory, structured, the kind of dress that communicated occasion without communicating feeling. Her hair was up. She wore her mother's pearls because they were the only piece of jewelry she actually owned. She'd met Alessandro De Luca for the first time 40 minutes before the ceremony, in a small anteroom off the main space. Their introduction had been brokered by Marco, who'd briefly outlined the arrangement in language so businesslike it had the texture of contract law. Alessandro had looked at her across the anteroom with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, "You understand what this is?" It wasn't a question. "I think so," she said. "It's a business arrangement. You'll have everything you need. You won't be mistreated." He said it the way someone says a thing they've prepared to say, which was its own kind of information. "I need you to behave as a wife in public. In private, I don't particularly care what you do." She nodded. He'd looked at her for another moment, like he was checking her for something. Structural soundness, maybe. Load-bearing capacity. Then he turned and walked out of the anteroom, and she'd stood there in the ivory dress with her mother's pearls and felt the specific texture of a door closing behind her that she hadn't opened herself. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Vittorio Moretti sat in the front row with the expression of a man swallowing something bitter and was doing it with enough practice that only someone who knew the tell would notice. Alessandro stood at the front of the room in a dark suit, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and when he slid the ring onto Isabella's finger, he looked at her hand and not at her face. She said the words when she was supposed to say them. Her voice was steady. She'd had years of practice at keeping her voice steady in rooms that required it. When it was done, the assembled men shook hands with each other in the manner of parties concluding a negotiation. There was champagne briefly, and nobody drank much of it. Vittorio left before 9 without speaking to Isabella directly. She watched him go from across the room and felt something she didn't examine closely. Alessandro appeared at her shoulder. "Car's ready." "Okay," she said. They rode in silence to the lakefront penthouse. His driver took Lakeshore Drive north, and the lake was black and massive on their right, and the city lights scattered across it like something had broken. Isabella sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the water and did not try to make conversation. He didn't either. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor of a glass building in Streeterville. It was large and precisely furnished and had the quality of a place designed by someone with excellent taste and no particular warmth. Everything correct, nothing soft. Isabella stood in the entryway with her small overnight bag. Lucia had told her the rest of her things would be delivered, and looked at the space she now technically lived in. "Your room is down the left hall," Alessandro said, dropping his jacket over a chair with the ease of a man in familiar territory. "Take whichever one you want. There are 3. She took the room at the far end because it had the best view of the lake and because it was the farthest from the main bedroom. She unpacked her overnight bag. She hung her mother's pearls on the small hook beside the mirror. She changed out of the ivory dress and folded it carefully and put it in the closet because old habits died slowly and she'd learned at some cost not to leave things in disarray. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room with the city below her and the lake beyond it, and she put her face in her hands and breathed. Not crying, just breathing, making sure she was still in there. She was. The first 2 weeks were a study in parallel occupancy. Alessandro worked from the penthouse most mornings, phone calls conducted in the study behind a closed door, meetings at undisclosed locations, Marco coming and going at hours that paid no attention to convention. He ate at odd times, slept less than seemed sustainable, and moved through the penthouse with the single-minded efficiency of a man for whom every domestic space was simply another operational environment. He was not unkind. He was also not present in any way that required reciprocation. He said good morning when their paths crossed in the kitchen. He asked once if her room was comfortable. He had someone deliver the rest of her things from the Moretti estate in labeled boxes that arrived on a Thursday. And when Isabella spent an afternoon unpacking them in the far bedroom, no one came to watch. She found tentatively that the absence of observation was itself a form of relief she hadn't expected. She started sleeping better. Not well. The nightmares were old and stubborn and didn't care about geography, but better. She started keeping a sketchbook on the nightstand. She'd had to hide the sketchbooks at her father's house, which in retrospect seemed like an absurd detail in the larger catalog of that time, but it had mattered anyway. Here, she simply left it on the nightstand. 3 weeks in, on a Thursday night in December, Alessandro came home at 2 a.m. when she happened to be awake. Sitting in the kitchen with tea, she wasn't really drinking and staring at the window at the lake below. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I sleep fine," she said, which was the reflex answer before the honest one caught up. "Not always." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the cabinet and got a glass and poured 2 fingers of whiskey and stood at the counter drinking it without any apparent urgency. He was wearing the jacket he'd come in with, and his tie was loosened, and there was something around his jaw that looked like someone had swung at him, and he'd moved, but not quite enough. "You're hurt," she said. He glanced down as if reminding himself. "Not badly." "Your jaw. I know where it is." He finished the whiskey. "Go to sleep, Isabella." She went. But she lay in the dark room and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and thought about the bruise on his jaw, and thought about a man who came home at 2 a.m, and thought about what kind of night required both. She knew the world she'd married into. She just didn't know yet what shape his version of it took. It was a night in late December that changed the architecture of everything. Alessandro hadn't known she was still awake. He'd assumed from the dark line under her door that she'd been asleep for hours. He'd come down the hall to the linen closet for a reason he no longer remembered afterward, and her door was open a few inches, not the way it usually was, and the bathroom light was on inside. He would have kept walking, but the angle of the light through the open door caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Isabella with her back to the mirror, reaching for something on the shelf above the sink, and the shirt she wore was thin and the bathroom light was direct, and the scars across her back were entirely visible. He stopped. Not from propriety, from the sheer arresting fact of them. They were not the scars of accidents. He'd seen enough of both in his life to know the difference with the certainty of someone who has spent years reading damage. The pattern across her upper back, 2 long parallel marks, raised and slightly discolored, came from a belt or a strap, applied more than once, applied with intent. The circular scar low on her left shoulder blade was a burn, something small and precise, cigarette or cigar, or the application of deliberate heat. And along her right rib cage, visible as she reached, the slightly uneven line of old fractures healed without surgical intervention. Bones that had broken and been left to find their own way back to function. Isabella lowered her arm and reached for the light switch, and Alessandro moved before she turned, stepping back from the door and down the hall and into the kitchen, and standing there in the dark with his hands flat on the counter. His heart was doing something loud and disorganized. He knew what those scars meant in aggregate. Not accident, not one event. A sustained period of violence applied to a person who had no ability to remove themselves from the source of it. The scars of captivity, of someone who'd been kept. He stood in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. He thought about the way she sat with her back to walls, the way she answered questions with her eyes slightly down before she corrected it, the way she'd said, "Yes, I understand," in his study that first evening with the tone of someone who'd learned that the shape of their compliance mattered to the person receiving it. He'd read those things as personality, as temperament. He was revising that assessment now, standing in the kitchen at 1 a.m, and the revision was doing something to the architecture he'd spent 8 years building. The woman he'd married as a weapon. The weapon his enemy had already been using for years before Alessandro ever got there. He stayed in the kitchen until he heard her door close. Then he stood there longer. The lake made no sound from 42 stories up, but he knew it was out there in the dark, vast and indifferent, the way it had always been, the way it would be after all of this was finished. He thought about his father's voice in the back seat of the Escalade. Thin and precise even at the end, the way that voice had always been. Never forgive the Morettis. He'd carried that instruction for 8 years without questioning it. He'd rebuilt an empire around it. He'd designed an act of revenge precise enough to outlast the man he was taking revenge on. But standing in the kitchen of the penthouse at 1 in the morning, he was beginning to understand, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had walked into a room he hadn't finished mapping. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed door, the woman he'd married was sleeping in a house that was safer than the last one, with scars on her back that told a story he hadn't known to ask about. His phone buzzed on the counter. Marco's number. Alessandro stared at the screen. His jaw was tight. Something in his chest was doing something he didn't have clean language for yet. He answered it. "We've got a problem," Marco said. "Vittorio just made a move on the Navy Pier shipment. 3 of our guys. Alessandro I heard you." "He's not waiting. Whatever he thinks is happening, he's not waiting." Alessandro looked down the dark hallway toward the closed door at the far end. The weight of what he'd just understood and the weight of what Marco was telling him pressed against each other inside his chest, and neither yielded to the other. "Get the cars," Alessandro said. "I'll be down in 10 minutes." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for one more moment, looking at nothing. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went to get his jacket and walked out of the penthouse into whatever was coming next, leaving behind a silence that felt, for the first time in 8 years, less like clarity and more like the moment before something you can't take back. The Navy Pier shipment had been 3 containers of industrial equipment, legitimate on paper, which was the point, moving through a bonded warehouse off the lakefront before redistribution to buyers in Milwaukee, and Detroit. The operation had been running clean for 6 months. Alessandro had used it specifically because it was clean, because the best way to rebuild a financial infrastructure after 8 years in exile was to start with things that could survive scrutiny before you layered anything complicated on top. Vittorio had known exactly what he was hitting. The warehouse was still smoking when Alessandro arrived. 2 fire trucks and a CPD unit were managing the scene from the perimeter, which meant someone had called it in fast enough to keep it from spreading to the adjacent buildings. 3 of Alessandro's men had been inside when the devices went off. 2 were at Northwestern Memorial. 1 wasn't going anywhere. Alessandro stood in the cold with Marco at his shoulder and looked at what was left of the warehouse entrance and said nothing for a long time. "Semtex," Marco said quietly. "Small charges placed high on the interior columns. Whoever said it knew what they were doing. Wanted the roof, not the walls. Maximum internal damage. Controlled perimeter. Professional. Not Vittorio's usual. He's using someone new." Alessandro tracked a firefighter moving along the eastern wall with a thermal camera. The air smelled of burning synthetic material and wet concrete, and something underneath that he'd learned long ago not to identify too precisely. Who died? Caruso. He kept his face still. Caruso had been 26, had a wife in Bridgeport and a daughter who was almost 2. Alessandro had known him for 8 months, which wasn't long enough to constitute a real accounting, but was long enough to owe him something. "Get his family moved," Alessandro said. "Tonight. Use the Naperville safe house. Don't let them stay in Bridgeport." "Already called." "And the 2 at Northwestern?" "Ricci's got a broken collarbone and burns on his forearms. He'll keep. Dominguez took a piece of ceiling on his left leg. They're not sure about the knee yet." Alessandro turned away from the warehouse. The cold off the lake was the specific kind that got inside your coat and stayed there. And he felt it now, in a way he hadn't an hour ago, when he'd been standing in his kitchen thinking about scars. He'd compartmentalized that, filed it in a section of himself he'd deal with when the operational situation permitted. He was good at compartmentalizing. He'd had to become good at it. "Vittorio sent a message with the hit?" he asked. Marco pulled his phone and read from the screen. "Return what is mine, and the account is settled." Alessandro almost laughed. It came out of him without warmth, a short exhalation that was mostly air. "He thinks she's property." "She is, to him." "What does he think I'm going to do? Hand her back?" Marco pocketed the phone. He looked at Alessandro carefully, the way he'd been looking at him since they'd arrived, with the specific attention of a man waiting to understand something. "What are you going to do?" Alessandro looked at the smoking warehouse one more time. One dead, two hurt, a clean operation burned to the foundation because Vittorio Moretti believed that Alessandro De Luca could be pressured into returning a woman the same way you pressured someone into returning a stolen car. The miscalculation was almost insulting. "Tomorrow morning," Alessandro said, "I want every Moretti subsidiary operation in Cook County under surveillance. Every truck, every warehouse, every handshake meeting. I want to know the shape of everything he has left before I start taking it apart." "And Isabella?" Alessandro started walking toward the car. "She stays where she is." He got back to the penthouse at 4:30 in the morning. The hallway light was on, the small one near the entry that they'd both taken to leaving on, a habit that had developed without discussion. Isabella's door was closed. He stood in the entry for a moment, listening to the quality of the silence, which was the silence of someone asleep rather than someone awake and quiet, and he was surprised to find that the distinction mattered to him. He showered and changed and sat in the study with a glass of water and his laptop and worked until 7. At 7:15, he heard movement in the kitchen and the specific sound of the coffee machine, and at 7:40, he walked down the hall and found Isabella at the kitchen table with a mug and the sketchbook open in front of her. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went to his face and stayed there a beat longer than usual, which meant she was reading him, which meant she was better at it than he'd given her credit for. "Something happened last night," she said. Not a question. "Business." "You came in at 4:30. He went to the coffee machine. "You were awake." "I heard the door." A pause. "Is everyone—" "Don't." He said it without turning around. "You don't need to ask about the operational side of things." She was quiet. He poured his coffee and turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her across the kitchen, and she was looking back at him with an expression he was still developing the vocabulary for. Not fear, not quite. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as resignation, but wasn't that either. "I'm not asking for information," she said carefully. "I'm asking if people got hurt." He looked at her. "One man died." Something moved through her face. "I'm sorry." "You didn't do anything." "No." Her voice was even. "But you should still be able to hear it." He didn't answer that. He drank his coffee, and she closed the sketchbook without making a production of it, and they were in the kitchen together for another few minutes, in a silence that had a different quality than the silences 2 weeks ago. Charged differently. Aware of itself. "Your father sent a message," Alessandro said. Her hand stilled around the mug. "What kind of message?" "The warehouse fire was his. He wants you back." Alessandro watched her face. "He called you what is mine?" Isabella didn't react the way he expected. She didn't panic or go pale or reach for composure like it was a tool she needed. She went very still in the particular way that Alessandro was beginning to understand meant she was managing something internal that she didn't intend to let reach the surface. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No. People are going to keep getting hurt because of me." "Because of him." Alessandro set down his mug. "There's a difference." She looked at him then, directly, with something that was almost confrontational. "Is there? You married me to use against him. He burned your warehouse to get me back. The variable in both equations is the same." The accuracy of it landed in his chest with a precision that was uncomfortable. He held her gaze and didn't look away from it. "Yes, the variable is the same." She nodded once, like he'd confirmed something she'd already decided to accept. She picked up her mug and stood. "I won't get in your way," she said. "I know what this is." She left the kitchen. Alessandro stood at the counter and looked at the space she'd occupied and thought, with the cold part of his mind that was always running calculations, "She is smarter than I planned for." The warmer part, which he was less accustomed to consulting, thought something else entirely. Marco came to the penthouse at 10 with Teo Rinaldi, no relation to Marco despite the name, who ran Alessandro's intelligence operation, and who had the energy of a man who consumed information the way other people consumed caffeine, constantly, compulsively, and with significant irritability when deprived. They spread a city map across the dining table, and Teo talked for 40 minutes while Alessandro listened and Marco annotated. Vittorio's remaining operations in Cook County were fewer than Alessandro had expected, and in worse shape than the public accounting suggested. 3 warehouses in the South Loop still operational but running at reduced capacity. A transportation company in Cicero that moved legitimate freight and less legitimate freight in approximately equal proportion. A property management company in River North that existed primarily to launder money through residential real estate transactions. And the estate in Evanston, which was the command center for everything and which was staffed accordingly. "He's bleeding," Teo said. "Has been since spring. Whatever hit his Bridgeport operation in August, and I'm going to guess that wasn't random, took out his primary cash liquidity. He's been restructuring since then, and it hasn't gone smoothly." Alessandro kept his expression neutral. The Bridgeport operation in August had been one of his, run through a third-party contractor with no visible connection to DeLuca interests. "So the marriage wasn't just about the symbolism," Marco said. "No. He was looking at Isabella's inheritance from her mother, the Tesoro Trust, about 40 million in commercial property interests held in her name since she turned 25. Vittorio can't touch it directly. But if he could position himself as managing her affairs under some kind of guardianship argument..." Teo shrugged. He'd been building that case for 2 years, having her declared incompetent, basically. Quietly. Alessandro went very still. He was going to have her declared incompetent, he said. Not a question. He was repeating it because the fact of it needed to finish arriving. The paperwork was in process. 2 psychiatrists on his payroll, a Cook County probate attorney, the whole apparatus. Teo folded his arms. "Your marriage killed it. You took her out of his household, and his legal guardianship argument evaporated overnight. That's why he moved so fast on the warehouse. He's not just sending a message, he's panicking." The silence in the room lasted several seconds. "Where is this documented?" Alessandro asked. "I've got the probate filing references, the psychiatrist's names, the attorney. I want copies of everything." He looked at Marco. "Everything." Marco nodded slowly, watching Alessandro's face with the careful attention he'd been giving it since last night. "Alessandro, don't. I'm just going to observe that your investment in this situation appears to be evolving. My investment in this situation is exactly what it's always been." Alessandro straightened and looked at the map. "I want the Cicero Transportation Company's contracts pulled within 30 days. Use the alderman contact to get an inspection flagged. And the River North Property Company. I want a competing offer on their flagship holding by end of week. Outbid them by 12%. Teo started making notes. "And Vittorio's personal security," Alessandro continued. "How many on the estate?" 8 on rotation, 4 overnight." "Does he ever leave without the full detail?" "Thursday dinners with Alderman Purcell. He takes 2 men, uses the Evanston side entrance, not the main gate, and he's usually back by 10. Alessandro nodded. "Not yet. But the Thursday detail was going in the file." After Teo left, Marco stayed. He sat at the dining table after the map was rolled away, and he drank his espresso and he looked at Alessandro across the table with the look he'd had since the warehouse. "Say it," Alessandro said. "She's not what you thought she was." "No." "What are you going to do about that?" Alessandro looked at him. "Nothing has changed. You found out that Vittorio was in the process of legally imprisoning his own daughter to steal $40 million, and you think nothing has changed. The operational parameters, Alessandro." Marco's voice had the specific weight of a man who'd known you since you were 22 and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "You're not an operational parameter. You're a person. Occasionally." Alessandro said nothing. "She's been living in that penthouse for 3 weeks, and you haven't said 10 consecutive words to her," Marco said. "And I've known you long enough to know that's not indifference. That's you being careful with something." "You're overreading it." "Maybe." Marco stood and picked up his jacket. "I watched your father make the same face over your mother for 20 years. I know what careful looks like on a DeLuca." He left before Alessandro could formulate a response to that, which was almost certainly intentional. It snowed the first week of January. Real snow, Not the flurry and melt cycle the city had been doing since December, but the genuine article, 8 inches overnight and then another 4 during the day, the kind of accumulation that quieted the city into something that almost sounded peaceful. Alessandro found Isabella in the living room at midday, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with the sketchbook propped against the glass, drawing the skyline as it disappeared into white. She heard him come in, and her shoulders made the small adjusting movement they sometimes made, the half flinch that she'd gotten better at suppressing but hadn't eliminated entirely. He went to the kitchen and came back with 2 coffees and set one on the side table near her without saying anything. She glanced at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said. He sat on the couch and picked up the briefing document he'd been working through and read it without reading it. And she went back to drawing, and they were in the room together in a way that was... He searched for the right word and landed on sustainable, like 2 people who'd negotiated, without language, the terms of a shared space. After a while, she said, without looking up from the sketchbook, "My mother used to say Chicago in snow looks like a city that's trying to forgive itself." He looked up. "Did she grow up here?" "Born and raised. She used to take me to the lakefront in winter when I was small. Before..." A pause, small and self-contained. "She died when I was 14. "I know," he said, and then recognized that this might require explanation. "I did research before the marriage." She glanced at him. Not offended exactly, more like she'd confirmed a hypothesis. "What else did your research tell you?" "Enough." That's not an answer." He set down the document, looked at her directly. "That you've been largely absent from public life for 4 years. That your father's official explanation was health reasons. That you have a partial interest in the Tesoro Trust from your mother's estate." She absorbed this. Her pencil moved across the page. "What did you think health reasons meant?" He was quiet for a moment. "Before last month? I didn't think about it much. And now?" The directness of it caught him slightly off guard. She was looking at him now, over the top of the sketchbook, and her eyes had something in them that was neither accusatory nor forgiving, just clear, interested in accuracy. "Now," he said carefully, "I think your father is a man who creates problems and then invents explanations for them." She looked at him for a moment longer, then she went back to the drawing. "That's diplomatic." "It's accurate." "It's both." A beat. Outside, the snow was still coming down. The city 30 stories below was muffled and white and looked nothing like itself. "He was going to have me declared mentally incompetent," she said. Still drawing. Her voice was level in the way that required effort. "I found out about it 8 months ago. One of the psychiatrists he was using left a document folder on the desk in the East Study, and I saw my name on it." Alessandro went very still. "I'd suspected something like it for a while. The way he'd been talking to Lucia about managing my affairs, as if I wasn't capable of managing them myself. The way the attorney started coming to the house." She paused. "When I found the folder, I thought about going to the FBI. I'd done that before, actually, years ago. It didn't go well. The burn scar, low on her left shoulder blade, something small and precise. He did the math, and it arrived in his chest like a fist." "He found out," Alessandro said. She didn't answer directly. Her pencil stopped for a moment and then resumed. "I stopped thinking about external options after that. I focused on getting through each day. That was the strategy." He looked at her, at the economy of her movement, at the pencil moving across the page with the steady attention of someone who'd learned that small, controllable things were what kept the larger ones bearable. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up. "The research I did before the marriage wasn't complete. I didn't know what I was walking into, in terms of what had been done to you." He heard himself and the sentence felt inadequate, which it was. "I used you as a strategic instrument without knowing the full context. That's something I'll need to carry." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was complicated in a way he couldn't fully decode. "You didn't hurt me," she said finally. "That's a low bar. You'd be surprised how high it feels sometimes." The snow came down outside. Neither of them spoke for a while. He picked up the document again, and she went back to the drawing, and the city below them kept doing its patient, indifferent thing. The call from Vittorio came on a Tuesday night. Alessandro was in the study when Marco knocked and came in with the expression that meant something significant. "Vittorio, on your private line. He somehow has the number." "That's information in itself." Alessandro picked up the phone. Waited. "Alessandro." Vittorio's voice was the same as Alessandro remembered it from 20 years of peripheral contact, smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd practiced authority so long it had fused to his vocal cords. "You've been busy." "I have." "The Cicero operation, the River North property, the inspection flag on the transportation company." A pause. "That's not the behavior of a man who married my daughter for legitimate reasons." "No," Alessandro agreed. "It isn't." Silence on the line, the silence of a man recalculating. "What do you want?" Vittorio asked. "Everything." "That's not a negotiating position." "It wasn't meant to be." Another silence, longer this time. When Vittorio spoke again, something had changed in the texture of his voice. Still smooth, but with something underneath it that Alessandro recognized as the specific register of a man who was considering violence. "She won't protect you. Whatever you think you've built with her in 3 weeks, it won't hold against what's coming." "I'm not asking her to protect me." "Then why keep her? You've already made your point. The marriage is legally registered. The Tesoro trust access is frozen. You've cost me." A brief pause that might have been calculation. "Considerable. You've made your point. Return her and we negotiate from there." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. He looked at the city through the study window, black and cold and full of things moving in the dark. "She's not coming back to you," he said. "Not now. Not ever. If you want to negotiate something, negotiate what's left of your empire. You've got about 4 months of runway before I own every legitimate face your operation has." He ended the call. Marco looked at him from across the study. That went cordially. "He's going to move again." "I know." "Get the compound ready, outside the city. I want it fully staffed by the weekend." Alessandro set down the phone. "And I want Teo on Vittorio's security rotation. If he changes his Thursday pattern..." "Alessandro." Marco's voice was careful. "Are you moving her to the compound because she's strategically valuable or because you're concerned for her safety?" Alessandro looked at him. "Because those are different things," Marco said, "and how you answer determines what your next 3 moves look like." Alessandro didn't answer. He looked at the study door and thought about a woman drawing a snow-covered skyline with steady hands and talking about evidence she'd found and choices she'd made when the options were terrible and she'd survived them anyway. "Both," he said finally. "Get the compound ready." Done. He told Isabella the next morning at breakfast. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee and the sketchbook again. It had become the morning constant, he'd noticed. The sketchbook and the coffee and the specific quality of her attention in the early light before the day required anything of her. He sat across from her. "We're moving out of the city this weekend. There's a property about an hour northwest, more secure." She looked up, processed this. "Because my father called." "Yes." "What did he say?" "That you wouldn't protect me. That whatever we'd built in 3 weeks wouldn't hold." He watched her face. "He wants you back." Something moved in her expression, not fear he'd identified by now, but something adjacent, a bracing quality that preceded difficult information being handled. "He's not going to stop." "No." "Moving further away won't end it." "No," he agreed. "It's a delay, not a solution. I'm buying time while I finish taking his operations apart. Once his financial infrastructure is gone, he's just a sick old man with 8 security guards and a house." She was quiet. Her hands were around the mug and she was looking at the tabletop and thinking about something he didn't have access to yet. "Isabella?" She looked up. "You're not a prisoner in this." He said it carefully because accuracy mattered here. "I need you to understand that. The compound is secure. You can move through it freely. If there's something you need, you say so." She looked at him with that clear, direct look she'd been giving him more frequently in the last 2 weeks. Why are you telling me this? Because you've spent enough time being managed without explanation. A pause. Long enough to mean something. Okay, she said. Okay. She went back to the sketchbook. He went back to his coffee. Outside the penthouse window, Chicago was hard and cold and bright with winter sun, and somewhere in Evanston, an old man was on the phone rearranging the pieces he had left, planning the next move in a game he didn't yet understand he'd already lost. What neither of them knew, sitting at that kitchen table in the ordinary morning light, was that Vittorio had already made the decision that would end everything. Not a warehouse this time, not a message through intermediaries. Something that would arrive at the compound on a Thursday night with the precision of a man who had nothing left to protect except his rage. Alessandro's phone buzzed on the table between them. Teo's number. He answered it, and Teo's voice came through tight and fast. Vittorio just burned the Thursday pattern. 2 cars, 6 men, heading northwest on the tri-state. Alessandro, they know where the compound is. Alessandro was on his feet before Teo finished the sentence. Isabella looked up from the sketchbook and read his face, and her own went very still. How long? Alessandro said into the phone. 40 minutes, maybe less. He hung up and looked at Isabella across the kitchen table, and for one moment neither of them moved, and the morning light held them both, and the coffee was still warm and the sketchbook was open to a half-finished drawing of a skyline that looked like it was trying to forgive itself. We have to go, he said, right now. And Isabella Moretti closed the sketchbook, stood up, and did not ask a single question, because she'd spent 4 years learning that when the window opened, you moved through it before it closed again. And whatever came next, They took the service elevator down to the parking structure because the lobby had cameras that fed to a security company Alessandro no longer trusted completely. And in 40 minutes or less, there would be 6 of Vittorio's men on the tri-state doing 70 miles an hour toward a location that was supposed to be unknown. Alessandro had his phone to his ear calling Marco before the elevator doors closed. Isabella stood beside him with her coat half-buttoned and the sketchbook still in her left hand. She'd grabbed it without thinking and then seemed to notice and looked at it like she was deciding whether to be embarrassed about it. She kept it. Marco. Alessandro's voice was flat and operational. Compound is burned. Vittorio has the location. I need the Elmhurst safe house opened in the next 20 minutes, and I need 4 men there before we arrive. Use Carbone and whoever he trusts. How did he get the compound location? Marco said. That's the question we're going to spend tonight answering. Right now I need the Elmhurst house. 20 minutes. Go. The elevator opened into the parking structure and Alessandro moved fast, hand briefly at Isabella's elbow to direct her left toward the secondary vehicle. Not the car he used most often, the one that had the registered plates and the predictable fuel pattern. A gray Tahoe that Teo maintained under a corporate LLC with no visible DeLuca connection. Isabella got in without being told to get in the front or the back. She got in the front, which meant she was treating this as something other than being chauffeured, which he noted without examining. He pulled out of the structure and turned south and then west and checked the mirror 3 times in the first 6 blocks. Are we being followed? She asked. Not yet. But possibly. Possibly. He merged onto the expressway and settled into the middle lane. Not the left, where speed drew attention. Not the right, where exits created patterns. The compound location was known to approximately 8 people, as of this morning. She was quiet for a moment. You think someone told him? I think Vittorio doesn't find things. Things get brought to him. He checked the mirror again. Has anyone contacted you since the wedding? Any messages, any calls to a phone I don't know about? She turned her head and looked at him. The look was not offended. It was the look of someone deciding how to be accurate. No, I don't have a phone you don't know about. I don't have any phone. The one I use was set up by Marco. Has anyone approached you? At the building? On the street? I don't go on the street alone. He knew that. He'd noted it without registering it as the data point it was. She didn't go out alone. She existed in a radius defined by the penthouse and wherever Marco or one of Alessandro's men was within visual range, which was the same operational footprint she'd had at Vittorio's estate and which she'd replicated here not because Alessandro had required it, but because 4 years of a specific kind of conditioning left marks that didn't care about changed addresses. He didn't say any of this. The expressway opened up west of the loop, and he pushed the Tahoe to 75. "I believe you," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "That's the second time you've said something I didn't expect." "What was the first?" "When you said you'd need to carry what you didn't know. About me." A pause. "People in your world don't usually talk like that." "No." "Why do you?" He thought about it. The expressway moved under them. The city was thinning out to either side, the dense vertical compression of the urban core giving way to the horizontal sprawl of the inner suburbs, and the January sky was white and low, and pressing down on everything. "My father talked like that," he said finally. "He was a precise man. He believed that imprecise language created imprecise outcomes." A beat. "He also believed that owning your failures was the only way to avoid repeating them." He sounds like someone worth listening to. He was. Alessandro's hands were steady on the wheel. For 22 years. She didn't ask anything further. She understood what the number meant. They drove the rest of the way to Elmhurst in silence that had the texture of two people sitting with something rather than running from it. The Elmhurst safe house was a colonial on a residential street that looked indistinguishable from every other house on the block, which was the point. Carbone, 43, former military bearing that had softened into something more civilian, but not by much, had the door open before Alessandro pulled into the garage. Inside, clean, functional, aggressively ordinary. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen stocked with the basics, a study with a locked cabinet that held the less basic basics. Carbone had 2 men already positioned, one visible in the kitchen, one Alessandro knew was in the backyard without being told. "Fourth man?" Alessandro asked. "Polly's on the perimeter, street-level walk." "Good." Alessandro set his keys on the table. "Nobody in or out without my direct authorization." "Nobody." Carbone glanced at Isabella with the professional absence of curiosity that good security people cultivated and said nothing. Isabella stood in the living room of the colonial and looked around it with the specific expression of someone cataloging a new space for each exit routes and threat vectors, which told Alessandro something about what 4 years inside her father's house had taught her that she probably didn't know she was broadcasting. "You're all right?" he asked her. She looked at him. "I'm fine." "The room at the top of the stairs. Take it." She went upstairs without argument. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, and then the quiet close of a door, and then nothing. He sat down at the kitchen table with Carbone and called Marco. Bottom. Marco arrived 40 minutes later with Teo and the specific expression of a man who'd been running the same bad calculation through his head for the duration of a 40-minute drive and hadn't found a version of it that came out well. They spread what they had on the kitchen table. The compound's location had been in 8 people's direct knowledge: Alessandro, Marco, Teo, Carbone, and 4 members of the inner operational circle. Of those 4, Bianchi, Ricci, Dominguez, and a man named Crane, who'd come into the organization 18 months ago through a referral Alessandro had trusted. Only one had been in Vittorio's territory in the preceding 6 weeks. Teo had pulled phone records. It took him 12 minutes at the kitchen table with his laptop. "Crane," he said. He turned the laptop so Alessandro could see the screen. 11 calls to a number registered to a shell company in Rosemont. The shell traces to Meridian Consolidated within 2 hops. Alessandro looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Crane had been in the compound twice. Once for the initial setup walkthrough, once for a security review 3 weeks ago. Both times with full access to the layout, the staffing rotation, the approach roads. "Where is he now?" Alessandro asked. "His apartment in Wicker Park, as of an hour ago," Teo said. "He doesn't know we know yet." "Keep it that way." Alessandro stood. His voice had gone to the place it went when the operational necessity overrode everything else. Not cold, exactly, but evacuated of anything that wasn't utility. "I want him brought in tonight, quietly. No noise in the building, No scene. Marco was watching him. And then? And then we find out everything he told Vittorio. Everything. He looked at Marco. Everything, Marco. Marco nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting the terms of something he didn't like but understood. It'll take a few hours. I know. Alessandro. Teo was still looking at the laptop screen. His voice had a different quality than usual. Less the clipped efficiency of the intelligence operator and more the voice of someone who'd found something else and wasn't sure how to introduce it. There's a second number. Alessandro looked at him. Crane was making calls to Meridian, but there's also a number that called the compound's landline 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Landlines listed under the LLC, theoretically unlisted. The number that called it, Teo paused. It traces to the Moretti estate directly, not a shell. The estate's main residential line. Vittorio calling the compound directly, Marco said, testing whether anyone would answer. No. Teo turned the laptop again. The calls were made at 11 p.m., 12:30 a.m., and 1 a.m. on 3 separate nights. Vittorio doesn't make calls after 9. His phone records show nothing after 9 for the last 6 months, consistent with someone managing a health condition. He looked at Alessandro. Someone else at the estate was calling the compound landline. The kitchen was very quiet. Alessandro thought about the 8 people who'd known the compound location. He thought about the 4 in his inner circle. He thought about Crane and the Rosemont Shell Company and the careful, patient architecture of an infiltration that had been running for 18 months. He thought about the estate's main residential line, who at the Moretti estate would have the compound number and a reason to call it in the middle of the night. And who would Vittorio trust enough to use as a secondary channel without necessarily knowing they were being used? He thought about a woman upstairs in the room at the top of the stairs with a sketchbook and her mother's pearls. Run the timeline, he said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that, technically. The 3 calls to the landline. What dates? Teo told him. Alessandro stood very still. December 28th, January 3rd, January 9th. December 28th was 4 days after Isabella had overheard Alessandro tell Marco the full compound address during a phone call he'd taken in the study with the door open. He remembered it specifically because he'd been distracted and he'd been sloppy and he'd told himself it didn't matter because the study was secure. January 3rd was the morning after he and Isabella had sat in the kitchen in the snow and she'd told him about the psychiatrist's folder and the FBI and the burn scar. The morning after he'd told her the compound was more secure. January 9th was yesterday. He put both hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at them. It might not be her, Marco said carefully. Alessandro didn't answer. The estate line could be accessed by any of Vittorio's staff, Lucia, the security rotation, someone with access to Marco. Alessandro's voice was quiet. Stop. Marco stopped. The kitchen held the specific silence of men sitting with something none of them wanted to be the first to name. Alessandro straightened. He took a breath in through his nose and let it out slow, and when he looked up, his face had done the thing it did. The thing he'd taught it to do over 22 years of operational necessity, where it showed nothing that could be read and used. Bring Crane in, he said. Get me whatever he knows by midnight. I'll handle the rest. He left the kitchen and went upstairs. Whoa. He stood outside the door at the top of the stairs for a moment. He could hear nothing from inside. He knocked twice. Come in, she said. She was sitting on the bed with the sketchbook closed on her lap and her coat still on, like she hadn't been sure how settled to make herself. She looked up when he came in and something in her face shifted. Not the flinch, not the brace, something more specific. Reading him. She was reading him the way she'd been getting better at doing, and whatever she was reading was making her very still. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her. He thought about how to do this. He'd run interrogations. He'd had conversations designed to extract specific information from people who didn't want to provide it. He knew the shapes of them. He knew that the most efficient version started with what you knew and watched what moved. The compound's location was known to 8 people, he said. We've identified one of them as a Moretti informant, a man named Crane. He watched her face. We've also identified a second channel, Calls from your father's estate to the compound land line. She was looking at him. Her expression had not changed in any dramatic way. She was holding the sketchbook in both hands now, a small adjustment. 3 calls, he said. On dates that correspond to information you and I discussed. Directly. The silence stretched. You think I made those calls, she said. I think someone at the estate made those calls. From my father's residential line. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw had a set to it that he hadn't seen before, something firmer than the careful composure she usually maintained. I told you, I don't have a phone outside the one Marco set up. The calls weren't from a cell phone. Then, she stopped. Something crossed her face, not the look of a person calculating a cover story, the look of a person running backward through events and finding something. Lucia, she said. He waited. Lucia has access to the estate's main line. She manages my father's communications. She managed mine too, when I was still there. She knows his entire operation. Isabella's voice was steady, but her hands on the sketchbook had gone white at the knuckles. She also, when they were moving my things from the penthouse when they brought my boxes, Lucia supervised the packing. She would have had access to every room in the East Wing for 3 hours. The compound address was on a document in the East Wing study? Alessandro asked. I don't know. Was it? He thought about it. The East Wing study? No. He'd been in that study once, early, and he hadn't left anything there. But the sitting room off the main hall had a side table where Marco sometimes left documents briefly, and the East Wing entrance connected through. He stopped that thought, ran it again more slowly. 3 weeks ago, Marco had brought a briefing document to the penthouse and left a copy on the side table off the main entry. The side table that was visible from the East Wing hallway. Alessandro had found it still there the next morning and filed it, and the document had contained on its 3rd page the compound address embedded in a property assessment. Lucia had been at the penthouse the day the boxes were delivered. Alessandro remembered her specifically, upright, efficient, moving through the penthouse with the assurance of someone performing a task for her employer rather than a favor for the person whose belongings were being moved. He'd registered her as a non-threat because she was Vittorio's creature doing Vittorio's logistical work, and he'd been focused on other things. He looked at Isabella. When Lucia was here, he said carefully, overseeing the boxes. She was here for about 2 hours. Isabella's voice was very even. She went through every room to make sure nothing had been missed, including the entry hall. Yes. Alessandro stood in the middle of the room and felt the architecture of the last 3 weeks shift slightly, the way a building shifts when you find the load is being carried differently than you designed for. Not collapse. Redistribution. She found the address on the document Marco left, he said. It wasn't a question, but it was still running through his processing. And she took a photograph or memorized it, or she has a photographic memory, Isabella said. My father specifically hired her for it. The steadiness of her voice was extraordinary. He was watching her face, and he could see the cost of the steadiness, the slight tension along her jaw, the controlled quality of her breathing, but the voice didn't break. I didn't make those calls, she said. I need you to hear that as clearly as I can say it. I did not contact my father's estate. I have not contacted anyone outside this apartment since the wedding. He looked at her. The thing he'd built in his chest over 8 years, the architecture, the load-bearing walls, the structure designed to hold the weight of revenge without requiring him to feel the weight, was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. It was asking him to make a choice. He could hold the suspicion. Operationally, it was the correct move. You didn't discard a hypothesis because the subject denied it with conviction. Conviction was cheap, and people with enough practice could sustain it under significant pressure. He knew this. He'd seen it. He'd used it himself. Or he could choose to believe her, not because the evidence was conclusive, it wasn't, but because he'd been watching her for 3 weeks with the specific attention of a man who started out looking for structural weaknesses and had found progressively something else. And what he'd found didn't have the shape of betrayal. It had the shape of someone who'd survived so long inside a system of control that escape had begun to feel theoretical, and who was still, Despite all of it, managing to be honest in a room with a man who'd married her as a weapon. He thought about the sketchbook she'd grabbed on the way out of the penthouse. "I believe you," he said. She let out a breath. Not dramatic, small and controlled, a millimeter of release in the set of her shoulders. Her hands on the sketchbook loosened. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. It doesn't mean the situation is less dangerous. It means the breach came from a different vector than I thought." He turned toward the door. "Stay in this room tonight. Don't open the door for anyone except me or Marco." "Alessandro." He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. "Lucia has been with my father for 11 years, Isabella said. She knows everything. His operations, his accounts, his contacts, everything she's passed to him about you." A pause. "She would have told him about the conversations in the kitchen, what you told me about your strategy, what I told you about—" She stopped. He turned around. Her face had gone to a specific place he recognized now. The controlled surface over something that was working hard underneath. "I told you things," she said, "in the kitchen, about my father, about the FBI, about what he did to me." Her voice was steady. Every word was costing her something, but she wasn't letting it show in the delivery. "If Lucia was in that apartment and the walls—" "The kitchen doesn't share a wall with the exterior," he said. "The sound profile doesn't carry to the entry hall." She absorbed this. Some small thing in her face released. "But the study might," he said. And there was the other part of it, the part he'd been holding since the kitchen table. Crane, who'd been in the compound twice, and who'd been feeding information to Meridian Consolidated for 18 months, which meant the infiltration predated the marriage, which meant Vittorio had placed Crane before he knew there would be a marriage to surveil, which meant Vittorio had been planning a countermove before Alessandro had fully deployed his opening one. He stood in the doorway and revised everything. The interrogation of Crane happened in the Elmhurst garage between 11 p.m. and 2:30 in the morning. Alessandro ran it himself. Marco sat in the corner. Teo stood by the door. Crane lasted 40 minutes before he started giving them what they needed, which was faster than Alessandro had expected and slower than the operational situation preferred. What came out of the 40 minutes was this. Crane had been inside the DeLuca organization for 18 months, placed through a referral that Vittorio had engineered by compromising the original referent. A man who now owed Vittorio a significant debt and who had connected Crane to Alessandro's organization with apparently genuine enthusiasm. In 18 months, Crane had passed Vittorio the compound location, the structure of Alessandro's financial operations in Cook County, the identities of 3 key contacts in the aldermanic network, and the general shape of Alessandro's timeline for dismantling Moretti's empire. That was the operational damage. It was significant. It meant Vittorio had been running a response strategy that mirrored Alessandro's attack strategy almost in real time for a year and a half. But the part that landed in Alessandro's chest like something structural giving way was this. Crane had been specifically tasked 6 weeks ago with a secondary objective. "He wanted to know about the girl," Crane said. His voice had the flat quality of someone past the point of performance. "Whether she was talking, whether she'd told you anything about what happened to her." Alessandro was very still. "What happened to her?" "The FBI thing, years ago. Whether she remembered names, dates, whether she'd told you enough that you could build a case." Crane looked at the garage floor. "Vittorio was worried she'd given you enough to go external, federal level." "He killed a man," Alessandro said. "Not a question." Senator Hargrove, 2019, dinner party at the estate. The girl was 17. Crane's voice was completely without affect now, the voice of a man who'd run out of angles and was simply stating facts. "She saw it. Vittorio locked it down immediately. That's why she's been—" He stopped. "Say it," Alessandro said quietly. "That's why she's been the way she's been." He couldn't let her talk. He couldn't let her go. He was going to have her declared incompetent before she could get to anyone. A pause. "When you married her, he panicked. He figured you'd find out and use it, expose him federally before he could expose you." Alessandro stood in the garage at 2 in the morning and looked at the man on the chair and felt something that was too large and too specific to be processed cleanly. She'd been 17. She'd watched her father commit murder at 17 years old, and she'd been imprisoned for it inside the house where it happened. And she'd tried to reach the FBI, and her father had burned her for it. Literally, a cigarette or a cigar on the soft skin below her shoulder blade. And then he'd broken her down systematically over years until she'd stopped trying and started surviving. And then he'd tried to have her legally erased. And the only thing that had interrupted it was Alessandro De Luca walking in with a marriage license and an entirely different agenda. He thought about her voice in the kitchen. "I thought marrying you would be the final punishment." He put his hands in his pockets so no one in the garage would see what they were doing. "Get him out of here," he said. His voice came out level. He was still proud of that, technically. "Marco, you know what to do with the referent." He left the garage and stood in the side yard of the Colonial in the January air for a few minutes. The neighborhood was completely quiet. Someone had a porch light on 3 houses down. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the cold was clean and honest, and he stood in it until his hands stopped. Then he went back inside. He knocked on her door at 3 a.m. She answered quickly, which meant she'd been awake. She was still in the clothes from that morning, coat finally off, sitting on the bed with the sketchbook open to a page he couldn't see from the doorway. He came in and sat in the chair by the window. He looked at her. "Senator Hargrove," he said. She went very still. 2019, the dinner party. Something happened in her face that he'd never seen before. Not the controlled surface, not the careful composure. The thing underneath it, sudden and unguarded. Like a door that had been locked so long the person inside had forgotten it opened outward. "How?" she said. "Crane. It was part of his brief." She closed the sketchbook. She set it on the nightstand. Her movements were very deliberate, very careful, the way you handle things when your hands are not entirely reliable. "I was 17, she said. "I know. I've never told anyone the name. I reported it without names. I was afraid he'd—" She stopped. "It didn't matter. He found out anyway." "Yes?" She looked at the wall. Her profile in the low light of the room was very still. "He killed him over a zoning contract. The senator had stopped cooperating. My father had him to dinner and poured him wine and listened to him explain why the arrangement no longer worked for him. And then—" Her voice was doing something it rarely did, running on without the usual editing, the words coming in the order. They arrived rather than the order she'd prepared. "I was supposed to be upstairs. I came down for a glass of water. I was 17, and I came down for a glass of water, and I saw my father do it, and he saw me see him, and that was the night everything—" She stopped. Alessandro said nothing. He sat in the chair by the window and let the silence be what it was. "I thought if I could get it to the right people," she said after a moment. Her voice had steadied back to the controlled register, but something was different in it now. Not the steadiness of suppression, but the steadiness of someone who'd decided to let something be seen. "I thought the FBI would move fast enough that he couldn't. I didn't know about the handler. I didn't know he'd already been feeding them information for years. I thought they would protect me." A pause. They told him instead. "The handler who covered for Vittorio was the same handler who helped dismantle my father's organization," Alessandro said. She looked at him. The connection registered in her face. "His name was Carroll," Alessandro said. "He retired in 2021. He's in Florida." A beat. "I know where." She held his gaze. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her, at the woman who'd been 17 and come down for a glass of water and had her whole life turned into a prison for the act of witnessing. At the woman who'd survived it through a decade of systematic violence and control and had still somehow come out the other side with her hands steady enough to draw a skyline by morning light. "I'm going to finish this," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the January night was cold and quiet, and the porch light 3 houses down was still on. "There's more," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Tell me." He looked at her. He thought about what it cost her to ask directly. He thought about what it would cost him to answer directly, what it required him to be. Not the architect of a revenge structure, not the operational commander of a financial demolition campaign, but a man sitting in a chair by a window telling another person the truth about their situation. Your father isn't going to negotiate, he said. The warehouse, the compound location, Crane. This isn't a pressure campaign anymore. He's moved past pressure. He's in the territory of someone who's decided that a problem is better eliminated than managed. She was very still. He'd rather lose you than risk what you know, Alessandro said. That's what Crane confirmed tonight. The silence in the room had a different quality than any silence they'd shared before. It was the silence of a threshold, of a moment that was about to separate what came before from what came after. He wants me dead, she said. Flat, accurate, like she was identifying a weather condition. Yes, she nodded once, slow. She looked at the sketchbook on the nightstand. She looked at the window. Then we don't have the option of waiting for you to finish dismantling his operations piece by piece, she said. Because before you finish, he'll... Yes. So what changes? Alessandro looked at her. At the woman who should, by any reasonable accounting, have broken years ago and hadn't. Who was sitting in a safe house bedroom at 3 a.m. processing the confirmation of her own father's intent to kill her, and was asking what changes because she was already thinking about the next move. He felt something shift in his chest that was not the architecture. That was not the load-bearing walls of the revenge structure or the operational framework or any of the things he'd built to hold himself together for 8 years. It was something older than any of that, and significantly less controllable. Everything changes, he said. We move from dismantling to direct action. We stop waiting for him to bleed out slowly, and we go straight at the estate. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And you're going to have to tell me everything you know, everything you remember, every name, every date, every conversation you witnessed. Because if we're going to end this before he gets to you, I need everything you have. She looked at him for a long moment. The sketchbook on the nightstand, the coat on the chair, the window with the January dark behind it. Okay, she said, it's going to take most of the night. I know. Isabella. He held her gaze. What he did to you. You understand that what you tell me stays with me. I'm not going to use it as a lever. I'm not going to file it somewhere to retrieve later when it's useful. It doesn't go into the operational framework. She looked at him for a very long time. You're a strange man, Alessandro De Luca, she said. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not warmth exactly. Something more complicated than warmth. Something that had survived a great deal and was still, improbably, capable of the thing it was doing. I've been told, he said. She opened her mouth to begin, and downstairs, Carbone's voice came up sharp through the floor. Alessandro, we've got movement on the perimeter. 2 vehicles, lights off, coming up. Alessandro was moving before Carbone finished the sentence. He crossed the bedroom in 3 strides and hit the light switch, and the room went dark, and he was at the window in the same motion, standing to the side of the frame, not in front of it, looking down at the street through the 2-inch gap between the curtain and the wall. 2 vehicles. Dark SUVs, no plates visible from this angle, rolling slow with their headlights off like they thought the dark made them invisible instead of just obvious. They'd stopped half a block down on the opposite side of the street. Nobody getting out yet. How did they find this house? Isabella said from the bed. Not panic. Just the flat accuracy of someone identifying the relevant question. Same way they found the compound. Alessandro turned from the window. Stay low. Stay away from the windows. He was already moving toward the door. The hallway was dark. He took the stairs fast with one hand on the wall for orientation and hit the ground floor to find Carbone in the entry with a Glock already out and Paulie coming in from the back with mud on his boots from the yard. Paulie, Alessandro said. Back fence. How many approaches? 3 minimum, side yard, back alley, and the drainage easement on the north side. Paulie's voice was tight. They've got the geometry figured out. They've done a walk of the property. When? Has to have been tonight, after we arrived. Alessandro processed this. After they arrived. Which meant either a tail he hadn't identified on the drive from the city, or the Elmhurst house location itself had been compromised before tonight. and they'd simply been waiting for the occupancy trigger. Crane again. Or Crane's information, already deployed before Crane had been brought in. "Marco?" Alessandro said. Marco was in the doorway of the study. He had a phone to his ear, and his face had the expression of a man receiving news that confirms a bad hypothesis. 6 men minimum outside. Teo's van is 2 blocks north. He spotted them setting a position on the drainage easement 3 minutes ago. Marco lowered the phone. "Alessandro, they brought more than Vittorio usually runs." "How many?" Teo counts 8 outside. There could be more staged back. 8 men on a residential street in Elmhurst at 3 in the morning. Vittorio had committed everything he had left. That was the information inside the number. A man with resources didn't send 8 men to a safe house. A man who was cornered and had decided on execution over negotiation sent 8 men. Alessandro looked at Carbone. "Can we hold this house?" Carbone did a quick professional calculation, the kind that lived in the body rather than the head. "Not against 8. Not with the approaches they have. The geometry's wrong. Too many entry vectors for our numbers." "Then we don't hold it." Alessandro turned. "We move." "Move where?" Paulie said. Alessandro was already going back up the stairs. Isabella was exactly where he'd left her, crouched low on the floor on the far side of the bed, back against the wall, sketchbooks still on the nightstand like an anchor to something ordinary. She'd found the posture instinctively, low and against a solid surface, and he registered again that her survival instincts had been calibrated by a very specific school. "We have 8 men outside," he said, moving to the closet. He'd stowed his bag there 4 hours ago. "We're going out the back." "To where?" He pulled the bag and checked it. Phone, documents, the compact 9mm he'd carried since Zurich. "There's a car 2 blocks east. Marco's contingency. It's clean." And from there, he looked at her. She was on her feet now, coat in her hands, and she was looking at him with the focused clarity of someone who'd processed the fear and come out the other side of it into something functional. "The estate," he said. She stopped. "Vittorio sent everyone he has to this house," Alessandro said, "which means the estate in Evanston is running on minimal security. 4 men on rotation, maybe less tonight if he pulled from the overnight detail to staff this." He held her gaze. "We go to Evanston. Tonight." It ends tonight, Isabella, one way or the other." He moved toward her. "I need you to keep up. Don't stop for anything. If I tell you to get down, you get down. If I tell you to run, you run and you don't look back for me." She looked at him for 1 second, 1 full second of something moving through her face that he didn't have time to read completely, but that landed in him anyway, heavy and significant, the way things land when they're true. "Don't tell me not to look back," she said. He didn't answer that. He went to the door. They went out through the kitchen and into the backyard. Paulie first, then Alessandro, then Isabella, then Carbone bringing the rear. Marco had gone around the front to create a distraction. Not violence, not yet. Just movement, a car door, a light, something to keep Vittorio's men focused on the front geometry for the 90 seconds they needed. The backyard was maybe 60 feet of dead January grass ending at a wooden fence. Paulie hit the fence first, went over it without drama, landed in the alley, and crouched and scanned and gave the signal. Alessandro put his hand briefly on Isabella's arm. Brief, functional. And she went over the fence with a competence that surprised him. Not athletic exactly, but determined. She went over it because going over it was what the moment required, and she didn't waste time resisting the requirement. They moved through the alley fast, Paulie on point, Alessandro 2 steps back and to the left of Isabella, Carbone rear. The alley was dark and smelled of January garbage and old asphalt, and somewhere behind them in the direction of the Colonial, a voice said something sharp in Italian, and Alessandro pressed Isabella against the alley wall with one hand, and they stood very still for 4 seconds while Paulie held a fist up. He could feel her breathing against his forearm, where his hand was pressed to the wall beside her. Fast but controlled. Nose, not mouth. She'd learned at some point to breathe quietly under stress. The voice receded. They moved. The car was where Marco had said, A dark Impala in a church parking lot 2 blocks east, keys in the magnetic box under the rear bumper where they'd been placed that afternoon. Alessandro had it running before Carbone finished getting in. Marco appeared from the south end of the parking lot at a fast walk 30 seconds later and got in the back and said, "Go." Alessandro went. Popam. They took surface streets north and then picked up the expressway toward Evanston, and Alessandro drove 75 with his hand steady on the wheel and his mind running the approach geometry for the Tudor estate on Sheridan Avenue. Main gate. Guarded, camera covered, approach visible from inside for 100 yards. Back wall. 6 feet of limestone, continuous, one service entrance. North side. The property line ran adjacent to a small park that was technically public and that was also, in January at 3:40 in the morning, empty. North side, he said. Marco, in the back, was already on the phone to Teo, redirecting him from Elmhurst. "I know the park," Isabella said. He glanced at her. "There's a section in the northeast corner where the wall is lower. The limestone settled. It's maybe 4.5 feet. My mother used to—" She stopped. "When I was a child, I used to go over it to get to the park at night, when I wasn't supposed to leave." He held the information. A gap in the wall that a woman had used as a child to get out of a house she was confined to, now potentially useful for getting back in. "Can you find it in the dark?" he asked. "Yes." He didn't question it. He drove. The park on the north side of the Moretti estate in Evanston was the kind of civic space that existed mainly to give the neighborhood's property value something to gesture at, a 1/4 acre of mature oaks and a paved path that somebody's tax dollars maintained and nobody used in winter. Alessandro killed the headlights a block out and rolled the Impala to the park's north entrance and stopped. 3:47 in the morning. Teo's van pulled up behind them 90 seconds later. Teo got out with 2 men Alessandro recognized, Ferreira and a younger man called Weeks, who'd come up through the organization's Chicago infrastructure and who moved like someone who'd played serious contact sports and hadn't entirely stopped. 7 of them total, including Isabella. Against 4 on the overnight rotation, maybe fewer if Vittorio had stripped the detail for Elmhurst. "I need her in the car," Carbone said quietly, meaning Isabella, meaning he wanted her to stay. Alessandro looked at her. She looked back at him. "She knows the layout," he said. "She knows the interior." "Alessandro." "She knows where he'll be." He held Carbone's gaze. "Vittorio has a bunker room in the basement. Old construction, built out in the 70s. It's not on any blueprint the county has. If he gets to that room before we reach him, we lose the night." He looked at Isabella. "You know where it is?" "Yes," she said. "I know where everything is." Carbone said nothing further. He had the professional opinion written on his face, and he was keeping it there instead of in the conversation. They moved into the park. Isabella found the section of wall without hesitation. Northeast corner, just as she'd said, the limestone had heaved slightly over decades of freeze-thaw cycles, and the top of the wall sat at 4'6" instead of 6 feet, and a specific oak whose roots had contributed to the heaving grew close enough on the park side to function as a step if you knew it was there. She'd known it was there since she was 9 years old. Alessandro went over first, dropped into the estate's north grounds, a strip of dormant garden between the wall and the estate's north lawn, and crouched and scanned, dark. The main house was 200 yards south, lights in 2 windows on the ground floor. The north grounds had a single exterior light on the corner of the garage structure, which was east of their position. He helped Isabella over without ceremony, and she landed beside him and crouched without being told. The others came over. Marco was next to Alessandro in the dark. Ground floor east window is probably the security station. The second window could be Vittorio or staff. "Staff won't be up at this hour unless Vittorio has them up," Alessandro said. "If he's still managing this from the estate rather than on his way to Elmhurst." "He wouldn't go to Elmhurst himself," Isabella said quietly. "He never goes himself." "Right. He'll be in the study, west side of the house, second floor, or in the basement room if he's already heard that Elmhurst didn't go the way he expected." Alessandro looked at the house. The 2 lit windows were east, security station, as Marco said. The west side of the second floor was dark. He hasn't heard yet, Alessandro said. Then we have a window, Marco said. Alessandro turned to the group. 7 people in a dead garden in Evanston at 4 in the morning, breathing quiet steam into the January air. He looked at each of them the way you look at people you're responsible for when what comes next is going to cost someone something. Carbone, he said, you and Weeks take the east ground floor, security station. I need them contained, not engaged if you can manage it. If they reach a phone, the situation changes fast. He looked at Ferreira. Garage. There will be at least one vehicle we need disabled before we come back out. Ferreira nodded once. Marco, with me and Isabella. Main entrance. She has the key code, or we go through a window. Her call. He looked at Isabella. Key code, she said. North side entrance. It's a 6-digit sequence my father has never changed in 11 years because he believes the estate's physical security is sufficient. Something in her voice carried a specific weight. It's my mother's birthday. Alessandro held her gaze for one beat. Then he turned toward the house. Move. They moved across the north lawn in a loose formation, staying out of the garage light's wash, using the dark strip of ornamental hedging along the property's north border as cover. The ground was frozen and made almost no sound under their boots. The house grew as they approached it, the Tudor architecture turning from a dark shape into a specific thing: carved limestone, leaded windows, a structure that had been built to communicate permanence and that Alessandro intended to strip of that communication permanently. The north side entrance was a secondary door set into the limestone 12 feet east of the main north face. Isabella reached it, and her hands went to the keypad with the muscle memory of someone who'd used an entrance 10,000 times. And the 6 digits went in and the lock disengaged with a click that sounded enormous in the winter silence and wasn't. The door opened. They were inside. No. The north corridor was dim, a single low fixture at the far end, the kind left on overnight for navigation rather than security. The house smelled of old wood and furniture polish, and something underneath that Alessandro's body recognized before his mind cataloged it. The specific staleness of a place where someone had been ill. Isabella moved ahead of him without hesitation, which he hadn't expected and which he allowed because she'd earned the right to navigate her own history. She took them left at the first junction, away from the east side and the security station, and through a dining room that was dark and enormous, and through a butler's pantry and into the main west corridor. The west corridor ran the length of the house's ground floor and connected to the main staircase at the south end. Isabella stopped before the staircase and held up her hand. Alessandro stopped. Marco stopped. Footsteps above. One set. Slow, measured, the walk of someone covering familiar ground. They tracked across the ceiling, west to east, and paused. And then the sound changed. Not footsteps anymore, but the creak of a chair. Someone sitting. Study, Isabella said, barely audible. Alessandro nodded. He went to the staircase. The stairs were carpeted, the old, dense kind that absorbed footfall completely, and he took them close to the wall where the treads were most solid. Marco behind him, Isabella behind Marco. The second-floor corridor was paneled in dark wood that had been here since the house was built, and that absorbed the faint light from the window at the corridor's end and gave nothing back. Alessandro moved toward the study door. Closed, a thin line of yellow light underneath it. He stood outside the door. He could hear Vittorio on the other side. A voice. One-sided. Phone call. Speaking low and fast in Italian, with the clipped precision of a man managing a deteriorating situation. Alessandro looked at Marco. Marco held up 3 fingers. 3, 2, 1. Alessandro opened the door. Chatom. Vittorio Moretti at 71 with the weight of a failing empire on him looked smaller than Alessandro had expected. That was the first thing. He'd carried the image of this man for 12 years. The image from his father's descriptions, from photographs, from the careful surveillance of the preceding months. And the image had the scale of a threat that had shaped his entire adult life. The man behind the desk in the study at 4 in the morning was still large through the shoulders and still white-haired. But the illness had done something to the vertical dimension of him, something that manifested as a kind of compression, like a building that had settled. He looked up from the phone when the door opened. He looked at Alessandro first, then his eyes moved to the doorway and found Isabella. And something happened in his face that Alessandro had not seen in any photograph or surveillance. A flash of something raw and rapidly suppressed, gone in less than a second, leaving behind the flat, pale calculation that was his default register. He set the phone down on the desk. "Alessandro De Luca," he said. His voice was as Alessandro remembered it from the margins of his father's life. Smooth, unhurried. "I've been expecting you." "You sent 8 men to Elmhurst," Alessandro said. He came into the room and stopped 10 feet from the desk. Marco stayed by the door. "You stripped your overnight detail." A calculated risk. Poorly calculated. Vittorio looked at him. The pale eyes did the assessing thing, the clinical measurement, and Alessandro looked back without performing anything. He was tired. He'd been awake for 22 hours, and he'd driven through Chicago at 4 in the morning, and he'd come over a limestone wall and through a house in the dark. And what he felt standing in front of Vittorio Moretti was not the operatic rage of 12 years of imagined confrontation. It was something cleaner and colder and more final. "You want the empire," Vittorio said. "I already have it. What I want is a confession." Something shifted in Vittorio's face. Minimal. A recalibration. A confession. "Senator Hargrove, 2019. In this house." Alessandro kept his voice level. "And the arrangement with the federal handler, and the meeting in October of 2013, when you handed my father's operation to the Justice Department in exchange for immunity and territory." Vittorio was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk surface. He looked at his hands. He was doing a calculation that Alessandro could almost track, weighing the assets and liabilities of the current situation with the professional speed of a man who'd been doing that math for 50 years. "My lawyers," he began. "Your lawyers aren't here." "No." Vittorio's voice was dry. "They're not." He looked up, past Alessandro, at Isabella, in the doorway behind Marco. "You look well," he said to her. "Better than I expected." Isabella said nothing. She was looking at her father with an expression Alessandro couldn't fully see from his angle, but the set of her shoulders was the thing he read, not the old brace, not the compressed posture of managed fear. Something different, straighter. "She always was resilient," Vittorio said, as if this were a neutral observation. "I was hard on her. I knew it at the time." "You were hard on her," Alessandro said. The sentence arrived in his mouth with a flatness that came from the specific place where something large gets compressed into something very small and very dense. "I did what was necessary." "You burned her." Vittorio's expression didn't change. "She was going to—" "You burned a 17-year-old girl with a cigar to stop her from telling someone you committed murder in your dining room." Alessandro's voice was still level, still operational. He was proud of it, and he was also aware, in the part of himself that ran the honest accounting, that the levelness was costing him something significant to maintain. And then you spent years breaking her down systematically so she couldn't function independently enough to try again. And then when that wasn't sufficient, you started building a legal case to have her declared incompetent so you could steal her inheritance and eliminate her as a witness. Vittorio said nothing. "Look at me," Alessandro said. Vittorio looked at him. "You're going to tell me everything. The Hargrove killing, Carol, and the federal arrangement, every political contact you own, every account, every operation you haven't already lost." Alessandro moved one step closer to the desk. "You're going to tell me all of it, and you're going to tell me in a format that can be used, and then what happens after that will depend on the quality of what you give me. And if I decline? Then you get Crane's Night, minus the option of giving me something useful at the end of it." Vittorio was quiet. He looked at Alessandro with the pale assessing eyes, and Alessandro looked back, and between them the study held 12 years of accumulated weight, the weight of his father in the back seat of an Escalade, the weight of 8 years in exile, the weight of everything Alessandro had built in Zurich and Milan in the years when building was the only thing that kept him upright. "You've thought about this moment for a long time," Vittorio said. "Yes." "Is it what you expected?" Alessandro looked at him. No. Something moved in Vittorio's face again. The quick, suppressed thing. What did you expect? He didn't answer that. He pulled the chair from against the side wall and set it in front of the desk and sat in it, and the positioning of it said more clearly than the answer would have. We're going to be here for a while. Start with Carol, Alessandro said. Bon. Vittorio talked for an hour and 40 minutes. He talked with the specific quality of a man who'd been carrying something too long and who had, in the moment of losing everything, arrived at a place where the weight of the carrying had become greater than the value of what was being carried. He was precise. He was organized. He talked the way he'd run his operation, methodically, with a professional's attention to the sequence of events and the relevant names and dates. Alessandro recorded it on his phone. Marco recorded it separately. Isabella stayed in the doorway for the first 40 minutes and then came into the room and sat in the chair by the window, and she listened to her father give an account of 12 years of crimes with the specific listening quality of someone who'd suspected most of it and was finding that confirmation was a different experience than suspicion. At one point, Vittorio said, "Carol told me she'd filed a report. I had 24 hours to decide what to do." The room was very quiet. "You didn't have to hurt her," Alessandro said. "You could have moved her, sent her abroad, dozens of options." Vittorio looked at the desk. "She would have kept trying." "Yes," Alessandro said. "She would have." Vittorio looked at his daughter across the room. Isabella looked back at him. The look between them lasted a few seconds and contained things that Alessandro could only partially read. A father and daughter on the other side of years of catastrophic damage. The specific terrible intimacy of shared history that had been built on violence. "I want you to know," Vittorio said to her, that I am not without." He stopped. His face did the compression thing again. "I don't have the language for what I would need to say." Isabella looked at him. "I know," she said. Her voice was even. "That's part of the problem." Vittorio looked down. Alessandro let the silence run for a few seconds. Then, "The Evanston property records. Walk me through the offshore structure." Vittorio walked him through it. Bolts. At 5:47 in the morning, while Vittorio was still talking, Alessandro's phone buzzed. He checked it. Carbone. One word. Problem. He stood. "Marco, keep going. Record everything." He left the study and found Carbone at the top of the stairs, and Carbone's face had the specific set of a man holding something difficult in his hands. "Elmhurst," Carbone said. "The 8 men. They didn't find us. They found the house empty, and they've been running the grid since then." He paused. "2 of them made us here. They've been on the property for 20 minutes. I didn't see them until Ferreira caught one in the garage." Alessandro processed this. "1 in custody, 1 loose." "1 loose, yes. Ferreira's on him, but the grounds are..." The shot came from the east side of the house. Interior, not exterior, sharp and short, and followed immediately by the sound of something falling. Alessandro was moving before the echo finished. He took the stairs at a run and hit the ground floor corridor east and found Ferreira on one knee with a hand pressed to his left side. And 12 feet past Ferreira, a man Alessandro didn't recognize was up against the east wall, with a gun coming around toward Alessandro, and Alessandro dropped below the sight line as the shot went into the wall where his head had been and came up inside the man's arm, and the next 4 seconds were the specific 4 seconds of close quarters work that the body performs on autopilot when the training has been deep enough and long enough to bypass the thinking. The gun was on the floor. Alessandro stood with his hands on the man's collar and the wall at the man's back, and his own breathing coming faster than he wanted. The man was 30, maybe, with the specific expression of someone who'd just experienced a rapid downgrade in their operational situation. "Who else is on the property?" Alessandro said. "Just..." The man swallowed. "Just me. Mancini's in the garage." "Mancini is with my people." Alessandro let go of the collar and stepped back. "Sit down. Don't make me come back here." He went to Ferreira. "Where?" "Side. I'll live." Ferreira's voice was tight but functional. "It's not deep." Alessandro got him up and got him to the north corridor, and got Paulie on the phone, and then stood for a moment in the corridor with his back against the wall and his heart doing the disorganized thing it had been doing since Elmhurst, and he breathed through it until it steadied. 6 years ago, this moment would have felt like control, like the culmination of something he'd built. He would have stood in the corridor of the Moretti estate at 5:50 in the morning with a man's confession recorded on his phone and his enemy's operation destroyed around him, and he would have felt the specific satisfaction of a machine running correctly. He didn't feel that now. He pushed off the wall and went back upstairs. Marco was still recording when he came back in. Vittorio was talking about the offshore accounts, the last architecture of an empire that had been systematically demolished over 3 months. His voice had run down to something flatter, not broken, not theatrical, just depleted. Isabella was still in the chair by the window. She'd been listening for almost 2 hours, and her face in the early pre-dawn light through the leaded glass had a quality Alessandro had not seen on it before. Something that looked, improbably, like a person coming out of a very long darkness into the first thin suggestion of morning. She looked at him when he came back in. He looked at her. He held her gaze for a second, and she held his, and the second contained something he was going to have to examine later, when there was time for examination, when the operational pressure released enough to allow for that kind of accounting. Vittorio said, "The last account is in Geneva. Meridian trust structure, beneficial owner listed as..." The window on the east side of the study exploded inward. Not a shot. Something thrown, a stone or a tool or a piece of masonry from the exterior, and it came through the leaded glass in a cascade of small fragments and something behind it, something that wasn't masonry, something that hit the desk and began immediately producing smoke. Alessandro had 1 second to understand what it was before it detonated. Not high explosive, a flash bang, or something close, a device designed for disorientation rather than destruction. And even knowing what it was, the sound inside the study's contained space was enormous and absolute, and for 3 full seconds he was completely without reliable sensory information except the feeling of the floor under his feet and his own hands finding the side of the desk and holding. When it cleared, not fully, smoke still thick, and one of the study's wall fixtures blown out, he found himself facing a man in the doorway who wasn't Marco and wasn't any of his people and who had a pistol coming up. Alessandro threw the desk chair. Not elegant, not trained, just the heaviest thing in immediate reach. And it caught the man in the shoulder, and the shot went high and into the ceiling, and Alessandro crossed the room in 4 steps. And the next 10 seconds were not something he would remember in sequence, but only in fragments. A forearm, a wall, the specific crack of a man's head connecting with paneling, and then there was silence again, except for the ringing in his ears from the device. Marco was behind the overturned credenza with a hand to his temple. He was upright. Upright was information. Vittorio was still behind the desk. His face was white and his hands were flat on the desk surface, and he was looking at Alessandro with an expression that Alessandro didn't have time to read. "Isabella," Alessandro said. She was against the north wall of the study, upright. One hand at her ear from the concussion of the device, but standing. Her face was absolutely composed in the specific way of someone who has survived worse than this and knows it. She held his gaze, and the thing that had been building in the back of his chest since December, since the night with the bathroom light and the scars, came forward with a force that was entirely separate from anything operational, and that he was not, standing in a destroyed study in the Moretti estate at 6 in the morning with ringing ears and smoke in the air, going to pretend he could put back in its compartment. He crossed the room and put his hand on her face and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because in that moment there was nothing to say that the looking didn't already contain. "Are you hurt?" he said finally. "No." Her voice was perfectly steady. "Alessandro." The floor below them shifted, not structurally, a vibration, a movement, the specific quality of something heavy being relocated in the basement of a 100-year-old house. They both felt it at the same moment. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she said the word before he did. "The basement room," she said. "He's running." Alessandro turned. Vittorio was gone from behind the desk. The study door was open to the corridor, and somewhere below them in the bones of the old house something was moving, and Alessandro looked at the door and looked back at Isabella, and the choice that was already made before he was consciously aware of making it told him something about the last 3 months that he'd been in the process of understanding for a while now. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said. "Isabella, you don't know where the room is." Her voice was flat and certain. "I do." He looked at her for 1/2 second, then, "Stay behind me." They went through the door together, and the corridor was empty, and the house was full of smoke, and somewhere below them in the dark, a 71-year-old man with a failing body and 50 years of criminal architecture in his head was moving toward the one structure he'd built that was designed to survive everything. Alessandro hit the stairs at a run with Isabella 1 step behind him, and the house opened up below them. And somewhere in the east side of the ground floor, Carbone was shouting something, and the morning was coming gray through the leaded windows, and the whole weight of 12 years was... The basement stairs were behind a door in the kitchen pantry. Isabella knew this. She went past Alessandro in the ground floor corridor and pushed through the pantry door without hesitation and found the second door behind the shelf unit that had always looked fixed to the wall, and wasn't. A simple magnetic release on the right side, the third shelf up, that her father had installed when she was 12 and that he'd shown her once, briefly, in the manner of a man who believed that controlled information was a form of control itself. She hit the release. The shelf swung out. The stairs behind it went down into darkness. Alessandro was a step behind her. She felt him close, not crowding, present, the specific proximity of someone who was not going to let her go down those stairs alone. She went down first because she knew what was at the bottom. The basement of the Tudor estate was not the basement that appeared on any county record. The original foundation dated to the 1920s and gave you a utility space and a wine cellar and a storage room with limestone walls and a drain in the floor that smelled of old water. That was what the assessors had seen in 1987 and 1994 and 2008. What they hadn't seen was the room behind the wine cellar's back wall, another magnetic release, another door that presented as solid limestone until you knew what to press and where. Her father had retreated there the night of the Hargrove killing, 9 years ago. She knew because she'd heard him moving through the house in the hours after, and in the morning when she'd come down the wine cellar door had been ajar, and she'd followed the unfamiliar path and found the room and understood, without being told, that this was the place things went to disappear. She'd never gone back in. The wine cellar was lit by a single low fixture that Vittorio must have triggered from upstairs. The racks were mostly empty. The illness had curtailed his drinking 2 years ago, and nobody had restocked. Their footsteps on the stone floor made sounds that the room absorbed without much echo. At the back wall, Alessandro put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She stopped. He moved past her and examined the wall surface, running his hands along the limestone seams until she stepped up beside him and found the release herself, third stone from the left at hip height, slight give in the mortar. The door opened. Vittorio was inside. The room was maybe 20 feet by 15, concrete walls, a single overhead fixture on a pull chain that was already lit, and it smelled of the specific combination of damp and metal and old air that rooms smell of when they are built for concealment and used infrequently. There was a metal desk with a satellite phone and a locked box and a manila envelope. There were 2 chairs. There was a cot against the east wall. Vittorio stood in the center of the room with a pistol. He was breathing hard from the stairs and the running and the specific labor of a sick man moving faster than his body currently wanted to, and the pistol was held at the level of Alessandro's chest with both hands, and they were not entirely steady hands. The illness in his shoulder and chest was visible from across the room, not as weakness exactly, more as cost, as the price being visibly paid. He looked at Alessandro. He looked at Isabella. His face had none of the smooth unhurriedness of the man upstairs in the study. What was left was something older and more fundamental. A man in a corner with one thing left that he believed would work. "I'll kill him," Vittorio said to Isabella. His voice was level, but the level was being built second by second. "Step back through the door." Isabella stood still. "Isabella." His voice cracked on the second syllable, not breaking. Something between a warning and something else. something she didn't have clean language for and had stopped trying to find years ago. "This ends here. Step through the door." "No," she said. Alessandro had his hands at his sides. He was reading the room the way she'd watched him read rooms. The specific attention of a man tracking multiple variables simultaneously. Distance, angle, the stability of the hands on the gun, the positioning of the desk between them. She could see him calculating, and she could see, in the set of his shoulders, the specific constraint of a man who could not move without moving toward a bullet. "Put the gun down, Vittorio," Alessandro said. "You came into my house," Vittorio said. His voice was coming apart very slightly at the edges, the way structures do when the load exceeds the design tolerance. "You came into my house with my daughter, and you think—" He stopped. His chest was moving too fast. "I built everything in this city, everything you think you've taken. I built it from nothing while your father was still figuring out the difference between ambition and stupidity, and you come into my house at 6 in the morning and think you can just—" "Your daughter watched you murder a man in your dining room," Alessandro said. "She was 17. She came down for a glass of water." The gun didn't lower, but something happened behind Vittorio's eyes. "You burned her," Alessandro said. "And then you spent years making sure she couldn't function well enough to try again. And then when that wasn't enough, you started building a legal case to erase her." He kept his voice flat. Not cruel, just accurate. "Everything you did to protect yourself, you did to her first. That's the accounting, Vittorio. That's what you built." Vittorio's hands were not steady now. He was looking at Isabella. She looked back at him. She thought about what she wanted to feel in this room and found that the architecture of what she felt was more complicated than she'd expected. Not forgiveness. She wasn't there, and she was honest enough with herself to know she might never be. Not hatred either, exactly. Something that had survived too much to consolidate into a single clean emotion. What she felt, standing in the basement room where things went to disappear, looking at her father holding a gun with unsteady hands, was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been afraid of one thing for so long that the actual presence of the thing is almost a relief. She was done being afraid of him. That was what it was. She located the feeling and recognized it and stood in it without trying to manage it into something more presentable. "I'm not stepping back through the door," she said. Her voice was quieter than she'd expected, but it held. "You can shoot him if you decide that's what you're doing, but I'm not going anywhere." Vittorio looked at her. His face was doing the compression thing, but it was going further than she'd ever seen it go. Past the professional suppression, past the managed affect of 50 years of running an operation. Down to something below that. Something she'd seen glimpses of when she was very small, before she'd understood enough to know what to do with the glimpses. "I never wanted—" he started. "I know," she said. "That's the part you'll have to carry, not me." The gun lowered 3 inches. Alessandro moved. He crossed the distance in less than 2 seconds, not running, controlled, fast, and his hand was on the gun before Vittorio's arm could come back up, and the next moment was a brief and ugly negotiation between two bodies for control of a single object, and then the gun was on the concrete floor and Vittorio was against the wall with Alessandro's forearm across his chest, and both of them breathing hard in the low-lit room. Vittorio did not fight further. He stood against the wall with Alessandro's forearm holding him there, and his hands at his sides and his chest heaving, and after a moment he turned his head and looked at the concrete wall beside him, and something went out of his face that had been there for as long as Isabella could remember. Not dignity exactly. Something harder and colder than dignity. That had been mistaken for it. Alessandro stepped back. He picked up the gun. He checked it and put it in his jacket pocket. He was breathing fast but controlled, and he looked at Vittorio with the specific look of a man who had arrived at the end of something and was taking its measure. "Sit down," he said. Vittorio sat in one of the 2 chairs. Berset. Marco came down the stairs 20 minutes later with Carbone and Teo and a phone recording that had captured, through the study's open door, most of the last 2 hours of Vittorio's account. Teo had 3 flash drives with copied files from the study's desk. The manila envelope from the room's metal desk contained, as Alessandro had suspected it might, documents that Vittorio had kept as insurance against the federal handler who'd covered for him. Names, dates, transfer records, the full architecture of a protection arrangement that Carol had been paid to maintain and that now existed in Alessandro's possession. They stayed in the estate until 8 in the morning. Alessandro made 4 phone calls, 2 to attorneys in different jurisdictions, 1 to a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office who had been waiting for a specific kind of documentation for 9 years. 1 to Marco to begin the legal process of transferring Vittorio Moretti's remaining operational assets to a receivership structure that had been prepared 3 months ago in anticipation of exactly this moment. Vittorio sat in the basement room chair and said nothing further. He'd said everything he was going to say upstairs. What remained was the silence of a man who had run out of both options and the energy to invent new ones. Isabella stayed in the basement room through most of it. She sat in the second chair against the east wall, and she did not look at her father consistently, but she did not leave either. Something was keeping her there that she didn't try to articulate. Maybe the need to see it actually finished. Maybe the understanding that leaving before it was over was a form of the running she'd been doing for years, and that this specific room, in this specific morning, was where she stopped. At 7:45, when the attorney calls were done, and the documentation was secured and Carbone had 3 of his men in the house with Vittorio under what would become, by the end of the day, a very formal and very legally complicated custody arrangement, Alessandro came and stood in the doorway of the basement room and looked at her. "We can go," he said. She looked at her father one more time. Vittorio was looking at the floor, his hands were in his lap, and his face had the quality of a landscape after weather. Stripped, very still, showing what the surface actually was beneath what had been placed on top of it. He didn't look up. She stood. She walked to the doorway and through it and up the basement stairs and through the kitchen and through the north corridor and out the north side entrance into the January morning. The air outside was cold and clean, and the sun was coming up over the lake in the east, visible through the estate's bare oaks as a thin, brilliant line of orange above the tree line, and Isabella stood on the dead grass of the north grounds and breathed it in and felt it go all the way down. Alessandro came out behind her. He stood beside her and looked at the line of orange above the trees. Neither of them said anything for a while. "It's done," he said finally. "Yes," she said. The word landed differently than she'd expected. Not light. It didn't feel light, and she didn't think it was going to feel light for a long time. Maybe not ever in the way people used the word when they talked about closure. It felt instead like a very old and very heavy piece of furniture had been moved from a doorway she'd been navigating around for so long she'd stopped seeing it as an obstacle and had started thinking of it as a wall. It wasn't a wall. The doorway was open. She didn't know yet what was through it, but she was standing in the January morning at 8 o'clock on the north grounds of the Moretti estate with cold air in her lungs and the sun coming up, and she was, by any honest measure, still standing. That was not a small thing. He knit. The weeks that followed had the quality of aftermath. Not peaceful exactly, not quiet, but a different register of motion. Less emergency. More deliberate. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved on Carroll within 72 hours of receiving the documentation. His retirement in Florida ended on a Thursday morning in February when 2 federal agents knocked on the door of his house in Sarasota. The charges that followed were federal and multiple and included the obstruction of justice, the destruction of evidence, and the accessory after-the-fact elements of a case that had been waiting 9 years for someone to provide the architecture it needed. Alessandro provided the architecture. The Senator Hargrove killing reopened as a homicide investigation 4 days later. The documentation from the estate's basement room gave the Cook County State's attorney enough to move formally. Vittorio Moretti, by then in a medical facility under legal hold pending competency evaluation, not the kind his lawyer had tried to build for Isabella, but the legitimate kind, the kind applied to a 71-year-old man with stage 2 prostate cancer who had been arrested in his own basement, was informed of the charges while still connected to an IV line. His attorneys filed 17 motions in the first 2 weeks. 7 were denied immediately. Alessandro watched the legal machinery run and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, the specific absence of urgency. He'd spent 12 years building toward a moment, and the moment had arrived, and the machinery was working, and what he was left with, now that the operational pressure had released, was the quiet that lives on the other side of war. He didn't entirely know what to do with the quiet. He'd forgotten, somewhere in the 8 European years, what it felt like to not be building toward something specific. He spent the first week in the Loop penthouse dealing with the administrative consequences of what had happened at the estate. Property documentation, legal filings, the careful dismantling of the remaining Moretti operational infrastructure through legitimate channels now that the criminal case had given his attorneys leverage they hadn't had before. Ferreira recovered from the bullet wound in a private room at Northwestern, complaining consistently about the food. Carbone ran a debrief of the Elmhurst situation that produced 3 procedural changes to the organization's security protocols. Teo submitted a 50-page report on the Crane infiltration that Alessandro read once and filed and did not want to read again. Isabella moved through those first weeks with the specific, careful attention of someone learning the dimensions of a space they'd previously been afraid to inhabit. She was at the penthouse. She cooked sometimes in the evenings, which Alessandro hadn't expected and which produced, on a Tuesday night in the second week, the experience of coming home to a kitchen that smelled of something other than carryout for the first time in his adult memory. She painted, not the careful pencil work of the sketchbooks, but actual paint, on canvases she'd asked Marco to have delivered, and the paintings were nothing like what he'd imagined her art would look like. They were large and dark and not quite abstract, built from shapes that the eye kept trying to resolve into specific things and couldn't quite. They were very good. She had a consultation with an attorney about the Tesoro Trust, which was now fully accessible to her, and which she handled with the practical efficiency of someone who had been managing things in her head for years while being denied the ability to manage them in practice. She made a decision about the principal residence and informed Alessandro of the decision without asking him to weigh in on it, and he registered this, the directness of it, the assurance, with the specific attention he'd been giving everything she did since the estate. She was different, not in the way that transformation gets described, not a sudden opening or a discovered self that hadn't existed before. More like the structure had always been there and the things piled on top of it had been removed piece by piece until what it actually was could be seen clearly. She was direct in ways she'd been careful before. She held eye contact in conversations longer. She laughed more. Not often, not performatively, but in the specific way of someone who finds something genuinely unexpected and doesn't censor the response. She still locked the bathroom door. She still woke sometimes at 2 a.m. with the residue of something bad. These things were going to take longer than weeks, and she knew it, and Alessandro knew it, and they didn't make either of them the topic of conversation they hadn't agreed to have. The things that needed time were getting time. What they had agreed to, without language, was this. Something between them had been named in the basement room of the estate at 6 a.m, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. Alessandro was not practiced at not pretending otherwise. He'd spent 12 years with his interior life organized around utility, feeling things that served the purpose and containing the rest. What he felt about Isabella Moretti did not serve a purpose. It was not a tool, and it was not a strategy, and it had arrived without his permission while he was looking the other way, and it had, in the precise manner of things that arrive without permission, made itself completely at home. He told her on a Wednesday evening in March. Not a speech, not a declaration. He came into the kitchen where she was standing at the counter with paint on her forearms, reading something on her phone, and he said, "I need to tell you something." She put the phone down, looked at him. "What I felt going into that estate," he said, "it wasn't about my father. It stopped being about my father somewhere between December and that morning. I need you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. The paint on her forearms was a dark blue-green, the color he'd seen appearing in the new canvases, and there was a small smear of it at her collarbone that she hadn't noticed. "I know," she said. "You knew. I've been watching you for 3 months." Something in her face did the complicated thing it sometimes did. Not quite a smile, not one either. "You're not as hard to read as you think you are." He looked at her. Marco said the same thing. Marco is perceptive. Marco is infuriating. She did smile then, briefly, and it arrived in his chest the way it always arrived, without his permission and completely at home. He crossed the kitchen and stood close to her, and she looked up at him with the clear, direct look that had been one of the first things he'd calibrated to back in the terrible anteroom before the 11-minute wedding, when she'd said, "I think so," and he'd registered it as compliance and been wrong about what it was. It had been assessment. She'd been assessing him from the first moment, carefully, the way someone assesses a new structural situation when the previous one has been catastrophic, looking for what it actually is rather than what it presents as. And she'd done that through 3 months of operational chaos and psychological revelation and a basement room and a January dawn, and here she was in the kitchen on a Wednesday in March, having concluded, apparently, that the assessment was satisfactory. "I didn't know how to do this," he said. "The part after. I've been building towards something for 12 years, and I got there, and I don't know what the after looks like." "Neither do I," she said. "That makes 2 of us." "That's not reassuring." "I know." Her hand came up and touched his jaw briefly, where the bruise from December had long since faded. "We'll figure it out." He looked at her, at the paint on her forearms and the smear at her collarbone, and the clear eyes that had survived everything they'd survived and were still improbably capable of this, of looking at him in a kitchen on a Wednesday and meaning it. He kissed her, not the way the night of the estate had been, not urgent or desperate or operating under the pressure of something that might end. Slow, careful, like a man who has arrived somewhere after a very long time traveling, and is taking a moment to register the fact of arrival before doing anything else. She kissed him back the same way, like she had nowhere else to be, like she'd already decided. The Tesoro Trust properties were reorganized over the following months under Isabella's direct management, with legal counsel she'd selected herself. The primary Evanston property, the Tudor estate on Sheridan Avenue, went into a different kind of process. Isabella spent 2 weeks at the end of March going through it room by room with a methodical attention that Alessandro recognized as a form of work she needed to do. And at the end of those 2 weeks, she told him she was donating it. Not selling, donating. A family services organization that ran transitional housing for women and children in crisis situations received the property documentation in April. The transfer took 6 weeks to finalize, and produced a press release that Alessandro's communications attorney reviewed for legal exposure and found clean. When the transfer was complete, Isabella came home from the attorney's office, set her bag down in the entry of the penthouse, and stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides and her face doing something Alessandro couldn't fully read from across the room. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up. "Yes." A pause. "It's the right use of the space." "I know." She picked up her bag and went down the hall to the studio, the 3rd bedroom that had become a studio 2 months ago when the canvases got too large to keep in the bedroom. And he heard paint things being moved and the specific quiet that settled when she was working. And he went back to the document he'd been reviewing, and they were in the penthouse together in the ordinary Wednesday afternoon way that had become the architecture of their life. He found most days that it was enough, more than enough. It was the specific texture of something he hadn't known to want, because he'd been too busy building defenses against losing it to consider that having it might be an option. Marco came to dinner in April for the first time as something other than an operational necessity. He arrived with a bottle of wine he'd been holding for a specific occasion and didn't explain the occasion, and Isabella cooked, and the 3 of them sat at the dining table that had once been a surface for city maps and surveillance photographs and talked about things that had nothing to do with operations or territory or the legal proceedings that were running through the federal system on their own momentum now, requiring Alessandro's attention but not his constant management. At one point, Marco said to Isabella, "I told him in December, I said you weren't what he thought." "Did you?" She looked at Alessandro across the table. "He said I was overreading the situation," Marco said. "He says that about most things that are obviously true." Alessandro looked at the both of them. "I'm at the table." "We're aware," Isabella said, the not quite smile. "It's why we're talking about you rather than to you." Marco laughed, a real one, unguarded, the laugh of a man who was allowing himself something he'd been cautious with for a long time. He raised his glass. "Your father would have liked her," he said to Alessandro. He would have said, "Finally, someone in this family with actual judgment. The table went quiet for a moment. Not heavy, something softer than that. Alessandro looked at his glass. He thought about his father in the way he'd been thinking about him since January, differently than before, without the specific quality of grief that has been kept pressurized inside a revenge structure to serve as fuel. Just the fact of him. The precise voice, the way he'd been in a room. The 22 years of a specific kind of knowledge that you only get from a person and that ends when the person does, and that you spend the rest of your life finding the shape of. He'd carried the final command, never forgive the Morettis, for 12 years as a directive, a load-bearing instruction. He understood now that his father had said it in a back seat with blood in his lungs, and had meant something by it that had nothing to do with the literal years of construction Alessandro had built in its name. He'd meant, survive this. He'd meant, don't let them have you too. He'd meant what people mean when they say impossible things in the last minutes. Something that's really about love, dressed up as instruction, because instruction is what we know how to say when we don't have time for anything else. Alessandro had spent 12 years building an empire around a sentence that was really about love. He raised his glass. To imprecise language, he said. Marco looked at him. Isabella looked at him. Then Marco's mouth curved and Isabella's not-quite smile arrived fully, briefly, and they raised their glasses and drank. 6 months after the night of the estate, the case against Vittorio Moretti was still working through the federal system with the deliberate, unglamorous speed of institutional justice. It would take longer than anyone wanted and shorter than the crimes deserved, and the outcome was not guaranteed in the way that clean narrative required, but was probable in the way that thorough documentation and multiple cooperating witnesses tended to make things probable. Carroll pled in June to a reduced charge that was still going to cost him 5 years in a federal facility that was not the retirement he'd planned. The federal handler who'd covered for Vittorio and helped dismantle Alessandro's father's operation, whose crimes were older and in some ways larger, was indicted the same week on 3 separate counts. His attorneys told the press he was cooperating. His cooperation, Alessandro noted, did not change what had happened. It only changed what happened next to him. These were imperfect outcomes. Alessandro had learned, or was learning, to sit with imperfect outcomes without requiring them to become something cleaner in the telling. The De Luca organization in Chicago continued its reorganization through the spring and into summer. Not the same thing wearing different clothes, actually different. Slower and more deliberate, structured around legitimate operations that could survive scrutiny, with the illegal edges being methodically contracted rather than managed. This was not ideology. It was calculation, the honest kind. Alessandro had looked at what the last 12 years had cost and had decided that the model required revision. Some of the men in his organization followed the revision, some did not. The ones who didn't were transitioned out with a finality that nobody misunderstood. Chicago still whispered his name carefully. That wasn't going to change in 6 months. It might not change in years. He was what he was, and the city knew what he was, and the relationship between him and the city was the long, complicated, earned kind that didn't simplify into something comfortable just because you decided to be better about some of it. He was not a reformed man. He was a man with a different set of priorities than he'd had 2 years ago, making different decisions at the margin, living with the weight of the decisions he'd made before the revision. That weight was permanent. He'd stopped trying to put it down and started learning to carry it in a way that didn't make him useless. Isabella was not a healed woman. She was a woman who'd survived something long and systematic, and who was, with the specific nonlinear difficulty of actual recovery rather than narrative recovery, working through what that meant and what came next. The nightmares were less frequent by June, but not gone. The bathroom door stayed locked. She'd started seeing a therapist in April. Her decision, mentioned to Alessandro as information rather than consultation. And she went every Thursday and said nothing about it afterward, and he asked nothing. The paintings got larger through the spring. The dark blue-green shapes resolved in a canvas she finished in May that was the largest she'd attempted, into something that looked like water. Specifically like the lake, Lake Michigan in winter, the specific steel gray and black of it at night seen from 42 floors up. Alessandro stood in front of the finished canvas for a long time when she'd put the brushes down. It looks like the view from the penthouse, he said. Yes. When did you start painting it? She thought about it. December, she said. I didn't know that's what it was at the time. I just kept putting the shapes down. He looked at the canvas, the dark water, rendered from memory, from months of looking at it in the night hours when she couldn't sleep. She'd been painting the lake in December. She'd been painting it before either of them had words for what was happening in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and in the apartment over time. The slow and complicated thing that didn't have a name in December and that had one now. He looked at her. What are you going to call it? He asked. She looked at the canvas. I don't know yet. A pause. Something about staying. He nodded. He looked at the painting one more time and then at her, and she was already turning back to the studio table to clean her brushes, the movement easy and unself-conscious and entirely her own. He left her to it and went back down the hall to the kitchen and stood at the window for a moment with his coffee and looked at the actual lake, still there, still vast, still doing its patient, indifferent thing, and felt, in the ordinary June morning, the specific texture of a life that had turned a corner he hadn't known was coming. The revenge was done. The empire existed in a different form. His father was gone, and the man who'd arranged it was going to spend whatever years remained to him inside a federal proceeding that was slow and imperfect and real. And in the studio down the hall, a woman with old scars and dark paintings and steady hands was cleaning her brushes on a Thursday morning, and the life they were building together was not clean or simple or without the weight of everything that had preceded it. It was just true. That was enough. That was, in the honest accounting, more than he'd built any right to expect, and he stood at the window with his coffee and the lake below him and let it be what it was without needing it to be anything else. And the June morning moved over Chicago the way mornings do, without asking, without explaining, just arriving and staying for as long as it stayed.